Welcome back to a special edition of Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Key TV in Northern California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Sometimes serendipity calls. I was fortunate this year to attend the Sol Symposium in San Francisco, where I was graciously given the opportunity to meet with and interview some of the prominent figures associated with that organization and others in the field who support their vital mission. I was invited as a reporter, not a podcaster, and I recently posted a series of interviews I conducted there about Sol, the phenomenon it studies, and the ongoing push it and its allies are making to find out the truth surrounding the potential presence of non-human intelligences on this planet. I'll link to that report in the description. But as one of the few reporters prowling the premises at Fort Mason, I happened to be in the designated media room when a small crowd of colleagues burst in, happily engaged in chatter with a suddenly convivial Eric W. Davis. The day before, he'd given a talk on stage that left folks hungry for more. Here he was now, cradling a boxed lunch, ready to talk. I had a decent camera, one from my work at Key TV, and I asked if I could stay in the room while the interview unfolded. They acquiesced and told me I could shoot the interview myself and eventually post it here as long as I shared it with them first. They'd use the footage for their own final edit, and in return, I could release it myself thereafter along with my own analysis. I would therefore happily point folks to the American Alchemy YouTube channel to view Jesse Michael's report on the interview and what it means for the topic and for the broader push toward disclosure. With his version now posted, I'm free to share the film I took. To help make sense of it, I've invited the brilliant UAP researcher Daniel Elizondo to break down the interview and offer his expert analysis. The interview in total is well over an hour long, and I'm posting everything that came up. The first portion is hard science and outside of my expertise, yet I post it knowing that many folks interested in Davis and this topic will want to hear every word that was exchanged. To be clear, this video will be the entire conversation, from beginning to end, allowing you to make up your own mind as to his intent. Questions were posed to Davis by Jack, also known as Missile Man, by YouTuber and first-class gentleman UAP Gerb, and by Thenvir from the Catastrophic Disclosure YouTube channel. Links will be posted in the description. Missile Man largely led the interview. Having spent more than 15 years in the defense and aerospace industries, he has a background in math and physics and met Davis in graduate school while Davis was working for the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, or OSAP. Their affinity is obvious and helped propel the conversation. I remain endlessly grateful for the opportunity to sit in. I'm also grateful for the honor and privilege of welcoming Daniel Elizondo onto Neon Galactic. We start things off with a brief review of his background and interests surrounding the UAP topic. For those itching to watch just the parts with Eric Davis, that conversation starts shortly thereafter.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. My interest in this really just stems from falling down the rabbit hole one day, as a lot of us have. And one of the things that I've really focused my interest and my research on is the history of how we got to this present moment, right? Who are the people and the figures that have been part of this movement? Because it really has been a historical movement, starting back, you could probably say around in the late 60s is when some of these key figures start to meet one another. And Eric Davis is more of a latecomer to this movement, but he is a part of this sort of historical group. They call themselves the Invisible College. And a lot of the things that we're uncovering today, right? A lot of the things that we're hearing for the first time, you can find hints and whispers of such things and rumors of such things going back to, right, the 70s and the 80s. And so it is really fascinating for me to see how a lot of those things have come to light. And so I've published a PDF and called Loose Threads. I co-authored that with my co-author. He goes by the Hermetic Penetrator, right? So fun pseudonym there, but you can look him up on Twitter. And so Hermes and I wrote that, and it really does cover. There's not much about the present conversation that it doesn't cover. Let's just say that. But again, that's because we were looking at this core group of people, right? When you're looking at all of these various loose threads, they tend to knot in certain areas, and they knot around people and around places and meetings and events. And so, that's something I'd recommend. If no one's checked it out, it is free. You can find that on my Twitter page. My Twitter handle is Omega Point, and you'll find it pinned at the top there.
And I'll link it in the description so people can find that. It's absolutely brilliant. And shows the depth of your background and knowledge in the subject for sure. You talk about the knots that form around particular people. Eric Davis is sort of a legend in the field in terms of various sides of it too. It's not just the science and technology and the IC community part of it, but also sort of the Skinwalker Ranch, some of the more esoteric parts of it. He's also in that realm, and so he really is sort of legendary. And so when I saw him walk into the media room, I was just like, "Whoa, they got an interview with this guy." And then they let me stay. And their conversation focused pretty much entirely on the intelligence community and the secrecy, sort of how it relates to David Grush and all of that stuff, but more the technical secrecy side. And I would have liked a question or two about, what did you encounter? I think that maybe he has some experiences that he has yet to relate about the nature of reality, which is some of the stuff I'd
Mhm.
like to eventually get into with him. But I wasn't conducting the interview, and I think that they did a fair job with him, and especially because they knew him. But having listened to the whole video now, probably several times, what are your main takeaways? Do you think? What should people look out for as we're watching this? What are things that they should focus on?
Yeah, so I think that the main piece is you always have to frame these conversations with understanding that Eric Davis is a member or maybe a sort of former member of the intelligence community. Having worked in private defense and also having worked for the government. And so you have to understand that the story that you're going to get, the information you're going to get, there's always going to be probably a percentage of things that you're going to get that are just, bedrock truth, right? There are also going to be some things that are, half truths. There are things that are going to be mentioned but not contextualized, right? And that's not because members of the intelligence community are inherently dishonest people. It's just because they have to, right? Based on their non-disclosure agreements that they sign. Eric talks about that during his interview. They have to do these things in order to keep their security clearances active, in order to keep working, in order to, frankly, to safeguard national security in some instances. And so I'm not sure, right, if we're getting everything here, right? He has to hold some things back. He even acknowledges that he has to hold some things back. But we do get a lot of interesting tidbits and nuggets that are, really great in terms of a contextual, getting that extra context of knowing where's this information coming from, right? And not just where Eric Davis's information is coming from, but where David Grush's
Yeah.
information is coming from. It really, Eric has kind of alluded to this before, but it seems like he really went a little bit deeper here in talking about that basically Grush's investigation started with Eric Davis's investigation and Hal Puthoff's investigation. This is what Eric Davis was doing for a while, right? He was working and doing all of his, aerospace stuff that he's doing, his wizardry, if you will. But he was also at the same time conducting research and making connections with people. And he kind of talks about where he did this, right? That he did this as a part of Bob Bigelow's National Institute for Discovery Science, right? NIDS. He also did this as part of, he mentioned, the OSAP, that he also was very involved there. And then at the same time, he also was involved in other organizations, like the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, right? He made a lot of connections, through those groups, including George H.W. Bush,
Yeah, which was
including
yeah.
yeah, including Admiral Thomas Wilson, right? I think one of the biggest bombshells for me was him explicitly acknowledging that he received information from Vice Admiral Wilson and sort of talking about the factors that might bear on him bringing that information forward to Congress or not. And we can maybe talk about that later. But I think that that's, for me, Loose Threads really did focus on, or was catalyzed by, the publication of the Wilson Davis notes. And so I think that there's a lot of really great context here. that listeners are gonna hear, and then we can kind of circle back and talk about the significance of some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll start the video here, and then we'll check back in a few minutes, pause the video maybe, and offer some commentary and some observations for folks.
A compilation of the work done by Dr. Davis, Dr. Millis, and others through the course of the Breakthrough Physics Propulsion Project that was sponsored by, I think, NASA Ames, DARPA. Were there other organizations, NASA Marshall, were they involved? Was NASA Marshall involved in
No, NASA Marshall funded it.
Oh, they did?
It came out of their advanced propulsion earmark that they got from their congressional representative.
Yeah.
And then Mike LaPointe was in charge of that, and he portioned out money for the Breakthrough Propulsion Physics program at NASA Cleveland, which then was known as the NASA Lewis Research Center.
Right. And it's essentially a compilation of all attempts at...
It's a compilation of all of the topics that were studied by the NASA Breakthrough Propulsion Physics program. The chapters are contributed by pretty much most of the contributors of the Breakthrough Propulsion Physics program.
Yep.
So Mark Millis has 3 chapters, I have 3 chapters, Paul Gilster has an introductory chapter. Robert Frisbee at JPL was one of the early, not the main contributor, but he contributed at the very beginning in '96 and kind of left it after that when Mark Millis became the program manager officially when it got kicked off.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of contributors there, but there are a few contributors that were not part of the original program, and we asked for them to contribute chapters to the book anyway, because the work that they were doing was sufficiently interesting and novel and relevant to the topic of breakthrough propulsion physics.
How did your perspective change on what viable approaches were to breakthrough propulsion physics from when you started it to when you finished the project? What did you initially think was interesting that you threw away, and then what sort of came to the forefront when you
Well, what got thrown away is what Mark covers in I don't remember if it's chapter 22 or not. It's those concepts that don't meet the criteria for novel, disruptive innovation or testable or theoretically well-defined concepts. People come to you, or came to us and others, with all kinds of inventions and ideas, like the Searle effect, the Dean drive, those kind of things. Torsion, space-time torsion. And actually there's missing from this, there's actually a couple of people missing from this book who did not contribute chapters to the book. It's just because they were unavailable.
Yeah.
So Harry Ringermacher at General Electric actually did probably one of the best high precision experiments that could be designed under NASA funding to test whether torsion actually exists in space-time. Mm-hmm. And torsion, for your viewers, is basically just a defect or a crack or fissure in the space-time continuum. And Einstein looked at that, and it looked like the issue of, well, if you're gonna have a path of a particle undergoing motion through space-time, and it's gonna encounter this, what's the gravitational or space-time curvature manifestations of coming into that crack, going around it? What does it do to you if you go around it, or can you go across it? What are the physics consequences of doing that from within general relativity? So Einstein looked at all that, and he was trying to find out if torsion might give you a prescription to describe elementary particle spin. And he found out that was not the case. So he also found out that torsion does not produce testable predictions that we have observed. And it actually produces or predicts inconsistent results. And so he ended up tossing away torsion, saying, it's a great theoretical concept to look at, but it doesn't hold water because it makes the general relativistic field equations inconsistent. So it loses its self-consistency. It'll make wrong predictions of phenomenon already observed, and it's just not refined enough. There's just something missing from it. And it cannot definitely be used to describe particle spin, whether it be macroscopic particles or quantum particles. It just didn't reach that threshold. So Ringermacher actually did an experiment, and I'm not going to get into it because I don't remember enough of it anymore. And he did an experiment that was that was specifically designed to test whether torsion existed in space-time. And it was a well thought out apparatus, very well designed. They did it at General Electric, so they had a staff of physicists and engineers to help do the prediction on what such an instrument would be like and how it would function and how you would design it and build it. So they did it just like Kip Thorne and the big giant team that formed LIGO did when they got started looking at gravitational wave detectors in the 1970s. And so basically, Ringermacher had a great experiment, and he got a null result. Basically, he couldn't find any sign of any space-time torsion. And so at least at that level, it was thorough enough type of experiment. It's just like what Gary Nolan said, it was data. And then the data form the evidence, and then you interpret it in the context of the hypothesis, and then you form your conclusion. And the conclusion was, we don't see space-time torsion, so it must not exist, at least at that level. That doesn't close the door on torsion completely, because there could be other experiments somebody can think of.
Some other formalism, or some other approach. Yeah,
that's right. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that happen yet. And the interesting thing is that, like I said, if you go back to general relativity, and Einstein's messing with that when he was developing the general theory of relativity and its 16 field equations. It starts out as 256 field equations, but due to symmetry properties, you can knock them down to 16, and I think a couple more will bring it down to 10. So 10 field equations. And it just basically gets you inconsistent results, and that's a problem. So it's telling you already that you're not going to get right answers by incorporating torsion, and that's a problem, because that means you're trying to develop a physics that produces testable predictions that when you observe them, you're not going to just observe new predictions. You want to observe old predictions just to make sure the theory is still correct, because it's got to predict the old stuff that have been observed, old phenomenon. And it didn't do that. It just gave you wrong answers all the way around.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about like the nth order differential equations associated with GR, and you get 256 equations that only simplify due to symmetries, what is your perspective on the approach to like mathematical beauty in physics? I mean, do you insist, or do you have a notion that the theory of everything, or the gut, will turn out to be elegant, or do you sort of think it might be clumsy and clunky and 19,000 equations? I mean, do you have any perspective on that?
With regard to what? A unified field theory?
Yes, with respect to a unified field theory and the notion of elegance.
Yeah, no. I don't. I'm in the camp of physicists that we already know, and a lot of other physicists know, that Einstein proved that gravity is not a fundamental force of nature. It emerges from the fabric of space-time when it's distorted or curved or bent, or however you want to describe it, when it's not flat. And in time, it's not flat. So basically, where was I going with that?
Well, if it emerges from the vacuum,
so it emerges,
that might be elegant.
Yeah, it emerges from that. That's right. And we have, and Sakharov in 1967 in a Soviet journal, which got published in an American English version in '68, he gave a prescription which Misner, Thorne, and Wheeler repeated in their big 1973 book, Gravitation, which was my graduate textbook on general relativity theory. We actually went through the whole book in 2 semesters. So, basically, so again, I'm losing my train of thought again.
I spoke to Bob.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So Sakharov basically said he believed that the metric elasticity of space, described by the space-time metric, which is just a very simple equation, actually, and he said that should come from the quantum vacuum fluctuation, because he sees the quantum vacuum fluctuations as being the seed of all existence. And he was right. Basically, that started from Richard Feynman when he got the Nobel Prize for the quantum electrodynamics theory. Right. And then later on, when that got unified with the weak nuclear force, it became the electroweak theory. And then separately, we have quantum chromodynamic theory, which describes the theory overseeing the strong nuclear force, which basically emerges from quark or quantum chromodynamics, or the interaction between quarks and gluons being the photons of the strong nuclear force. They have,
Force
instead of,
mediators.
yeah, they don't have a mass, they move at the speed of light, they have a spin one, just like a photon does, but unlike a photon, they have 3 color charges, or it can have a combination of those color, actually they have 2 color charges. So they have a combination of color charges, which are a symmetry property of the theory. They're not they're not an electric charge, really.
Right,
They're actually, they actually have no electric charge.
And they generally can't be separated, is that right? You can't get color charged particles in terms of pulling them apart and having a color charge.
You can, but inside the hadrons you can. But
just inside the hadron.
But when you have high energy collisions, like what happened at the relativistic heavy ion collider at Brookhaven National Lab, for a brief instant, or just an instant long enough that you can measure it, you can pull the quarks out of the hadrons, they'll be mixed in with the gluons, and you will actually produce quark-gluon plasmas. And the plasmas will exist as an entity. I don't want to say a soliton, but as an entity on its own, and it's outside of the elementary particle from which it was created. The collider is colliding heavy atoms, usually uranium, lead, iron,
The
even
Phoenix
protons.
experiment is using gold,
Yeah, at
right?
99.9996% the speed of light. And so there's enough energy, center of mass energy in there in the relativistic ref frame that you can literally blow those hadrons apart. A hadron is basically 2 classes, mesons and baryons. And of the baryons, there's protons and neutrons. So basically you're looking at the heavy nuclei of these ions. So you strip the electrons off, and you're going to have these super heavy uranium or iron or lead. Gold and silver are another ones, and even as light as a single proton for a hydrogen atom nucleus. And they smash these things together, and you're liberating literally the quarks right out of those protons.
Yeah.
And then the heavier atoms, out of all the protons and neutrons, they bash into each other at really high energy. And so that's an example of when that happens. QCD theory is not complementary or compatible with electroweak theory. They cannot be unified.
Right.
That was a dream, that was a projection and extrapolation, and has not come to fruition.
Sure.
Likewise, gravity is not a force of nature. It emerges from space-time phenomena, the space-time manifold or the continuum, or however you want to describe it. And it's coupling constant. It's a coupling constant measures the strength of the interaction force between particles. So for the quantum electrodynamics, that's the electromagnetic fine structure constant. Then for electroweak theory, well, now that's blended in with the weak nuclear force. The weak force is responsible for the decay of quarks, in high energy quarks to low energy quarks. Radioactive decay is another one, where atoms transmute and decay away, and elementary particles are emitted, or even alpha particles, which are helium nucleus, are emitted.
Yeah.
So that's what the weak force. So it turns out they're both 2 sides of the same coin of the same unified force. Well, its coupling constant is actually the electromagnetic fine structure constant divided by 100 times the proton mass squared. So it's scaled to the proton mass. Very interesting lift. Phenomenologically, you come up with 100 times the proton mass.
John Brandenburg claims he can predict that with GEM. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I know him, and he's a great guy, but he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Sure.
I've tried to help him over years, and I just can't get
GEM
it.
derives from Bryce DeWitt's 1966 attempts at this. This is in this book, actually. It's how I found out about this, is that GEM comes from something Bryce DeWitt was doing in the 60s.
Okay, I'm not aware of that.
Yeah. I'll find the reference.
I've been following GEM since I first met John at an AIAA meeting in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And then he went to the Space Technology Applications International Forum Symposia, like I did in the late 90s through the 2000s. And I looked at every incarnation and every development of GEM, and it's not sophisticated enough. It's too simplistic, and he overlooks a lot of important factors. So we've got to skip that. So hang on. So then when you're talking about gravity's coupling constant, it has, the first 2 I mentioned have no dimensions. The coupling constant in general relativity is the universal gravitational constant times 8 pi divided by the speed of light to the 4th power. You know what the units of that are? 1 over force, 1 over newtons.
That's right.
And that's a coupling constant to convert the dimensional units of the stress energy tensor, which is the source of space-time curvature. That's in units of joules per cubic meter, or energy density, or pressure. because the equivalent is newtons per square meter.
Right.
Okay, so those have to be converted using that 1/Newton factor from the coupling constant into units of 1/meter squared. That's how you measure space-time curvature on the left side of the field equation. That has the Ricci curvature tensor and the Ricci scalar multiplied by the metric tensor and 1/2. And they take this difference between the two.
Sure.
So for that reason, we know we really can't unify those two forces. It's really electroweak and quantum chromodynamics, and we can't unify it to space-time curvature model. And that's why, and everybody's still attacking quantum superstring. It's kind of died away because it can't make useful predictions, or testable predictions. However, it's been very successful in mathematics and geometry and topology. They have predicted a lot of new things in those areas, but they're still hacking away at trying to get it to work as a quantum gravity theory. Same thing with quantum loop gravity.
Right.
And gosh, Roger Penrose had the most sexy version of quantum gravity that I fell in love with when I was in graduate school, and it came out, it was twistor theory. So he replaced the whole concept with a whole new, instead of a four-dimensional space-time point of x, y, z, and a t, or a different coordinate system, but you'll always have a time in there. And instead he was looking at energy, momentum, as a four-vector to describe an event in space-time. So we wanted to build an edifice of an algebra that handled that, then a geometry that algebra builds up, and from that he was hoping to get a unified picture of the forces of nature and gravity. And it was beautiful, again, like superstring theory, great, beautiful mathematical
mathematically
results
beautiful.
came out, geometrical. Oh my gosh, this thing is an exercise of the most advanced version of complex math. You've seen complex math when you were in aerospace engineering, so it just didn't go anywhere.
It just didn't give you anything useful.
Yeah, so basically, we can't see a unified field theory coming out of that.
Sure.
Well, to change the topic a little bit, the Bigelow Aerospace guys, the OSAP guys, the ATIP guys, y'all have been at the forefront of really starting the public discourse on all of this stuff, and the large reason for why we're here right now. And so Dr. Jim McCaskey, he's mentioned if he were asked to testify before Congress, he would actually lie before Congress instead of, speaking against his NDAs and to honor his NDAs and the things he's, sworn to protect. And so I know that's a bit controversial because at this point, Lou Elizondo has testified. We interviewed him last week, and
they did so under oath.
Yes.
So Jim didn't say what happens if he takes the oath if he takes an oath, because if he takes an oath, lying to Congress in a testimony is perjury, and he can go to jail for that.
No
and
matter,
you saw what happens.
No matter the NDA.
Huh?
No matter the NDA.
Yeah, actually, the NDA will prevent him from giving testimony.
But if he chooses to.
Yeah, but however, if they issue him a subpoena to appear before Congress, then he's going to have Congress, the committee staff, work with the DOD staff to figure out how he's going to do it. Now, here's how Dave Grush did it. Dave Grush was approved by the Department of Defense. I don't remember what the acronym means anymore. It's DOPSR.
Doctor.
Yeah. So Dopser approved his public testimony and approved what he could say publicly. The rest of what he couldn't say publicly, he said in a classified hearing. So we had a classified hearing on his whistleblower complaint. Okay, Jim would have to do the same thing, and Jim should know that. And I worked with him on the OSAP, so I know him. So I don't know why he said have to lie before Congress. He knows if you're going to take an oath before the committee, lying is perjury, and you're in trouble.
Well,
and the NDA issue can be worked out with Dopser.
Yeah.
But however, there are times when they don't administer an oath. But you don't want to lie because that'll be a public reputation damage on you.
Right.
If even though you didn't take an oath, but you lied before Congress, you lied. I mean, that's not good news. That's not.
Both Jim Lukatsky and Colin Kelleher appeared on a podcast not too long ago and kind of gave messages like they're not in support of sort of this coming out or disclosure, kind of suggested like they're not so sure that's a great idea. So in other words, he's probably not interested in necessarily doing that.
And I told, I've never been invited to give testimony.
So this is interesting for me. Lukatsky, right? I mean, he kind of plays this game of cat and mouse about what he knows and what he doesn't, whether he even supports disclosure, which is kind of this weird thing. I mean, it's like he doesn't support the process in front of the oversight committee, or I kind of don't know how to read that. What did you catch out of what Davis was saying here and his thinking around Lukatsky?
Yeah, I think it's really important to know just in the background that Lukatsky is really only given, I think, maybe one, maybe two interviews. I can't even think of what the second one was, but he hasn't been out there, right? He co-authored a book or a couple of books with George Knapp and Colin Kelleher, who worked, at the OSAP, not necessarily Knapp, but Kelleher did, and he hasn't, while he has alluded to some different things, there are some pretty explosive pieces of evidence, right, that he asserted in the book, one of which was that there was a craft that was retrieved that they were able to get access to. He actually makes that comment. And it's really important to know that this book went through the Department of Defense pre-publication review process, where they actually go through and they kind of sign off what you can and can't say. And in that book, it says we recovered a craft, right? And that they're discussing this in a meeting at the DIA, right? That they recovered this craft. They don't know what it's for, where it's from, but that they were able to get access to it. I wasn't at Sol, but I've heard through the grapevine that Davis actually mentioned, during his actual lecture, the Lukatsky went inside of the craft. I don't know if you can. Did he say that?
Yes, he did, and I thought he had said something similar to that with Jeremy Corbell in his interview, Lukatsky, with him and George Knapp and Colm Kelleher, something along those same lines.
Yeah, and so I think that obviously he's somebody who has a lot of information. That's the reason I bring that up, right?
Yeah.
He's someone he's not a secondhand witness. This would be a firsthand witness. I placed my hands on the craft, right? There are only a few other people.
Only a few of those people, yeah.
Right, that we know of on public record, or at least through the rumor mill, much of which comes from Dr. Davis. And so I think that he needs to testify, right? Like if you're in Congress right now and you're a staffer and you're wondering, who should I call up? Eric Davis essentially gives you the recipe here, right? He says that, obviously, yes, if you go to Congress and you're, and you're under an NDA, you can't go voluntarily, offer your information to Congress, nor does it seem that Lukatsky wants to, which he doesn't say, yes, Lukatsky doesn't want to, but he's sort of, as he's eating his sandwich, or I don't know what he was eating, as he's eating, he's sort of like, yeah, they don't want to disclose, right? And I would say that's probably true to some extent. I don't think he would have written the books if he didn't have at least a little bit of interest in sharing some of the information, but he doesn't want to testify in front of Congress. But Davis sort of, I don't know that he admonishes him a little bit, but he sort of says like, hey, he knows this, that he could do what Grush did, where get with the Department of Defense, work this out, go get with DOPSR people, work out what can be said in public, what can be said in a classified setting. And if they subpoena him, he has to take the oath. And if he takes the oath and lies, then he's perjured himself, right? And so I feel like he's almost saying, subpoena him, right? And he also mentions elsewhere that he has not been invited, by the group. In fact, I think he mentioned somewhere that he has a conversation, but it was a very short conversation, like a 30-minute conversation.
Yeah, and that there were questions that were left unanswered, he said, before the hearing, the most recent hearing, right? Yeah.
Right. And Davis is the kind of guy, as we're finding out here, you don't want to bring him in for 30 minutes, right? He's a rambler. You got to let him ramble. And it's through that you're going to learn all the things that you want to learn. I say that with love and respect because I'm the same way. And so it's just one where you can't do 30-minute interviews with the people who have been actually conducting this legacy investigation, if you will, right? The threads lead back to him and to Hal Puthoff and to Jacques Vallée and to all of the people who are kind of affiliated with this invisible college throughout the years. So I think that Lakatsky needs to be subpoenaed. And as far as why they don't want to disclose, right? That's a much broader conversation that maybe we can talk about, later.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's interesting though, like there's also, I mean, you don't have to lie to Congress if you can testify to them in a classified session, right? I mean, it seems like there's this idea that you're going to get called to testify in Congress and you're going to lie because otherwise it goes public. But if you're in a classified session, say in front of the Intelligence Committee, that's a whole different environment where your secrets are sort of safeguarded, you'd assume. So, and even Eric says that if he was brought in, it would only be in a classified setting. I mean, it's just interesting to hear.
This gets into sort of the way these special access programs are structured, right? A plain Jane special access program, NDAs related to that, then maybe, going in and talking to the intelligence committees, especially in a closed door session, is not as big of a deal. However, if you're working on one of these so-called waived, unacknowledged special access program, these are the kinds of programs that can be created by the president, right? They can be created, I believe, also by the Secretary of Defense. And I think the only reporting that they have to do is to members of the Gang of Eight. And so you're talking about a very, very limited conversation. And so when you're bringing in, I mean, it doesn't really matter what your political leanings are, but you're bringing in people from, these might be first year, congressmen that are coming in. These are elected officials, and you will find, and frankly, it's kind of hard to argue that elected officials may not be, someone who's going to be here for 4 years. It may not be really in the need to know for all of these different aspects. So there's some of it that is frustrating, but there's also some of it that I understand. These are state secrets. I mean, I'm sure I can think of 1 or 2 congressmen that I would not be super excited to have some of these super sensitive information, as I'm sure as anyone listening can, no matter their lean, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are some kooks in Congress, possibly in the hundreds.
Yeah.
Follow up to that, I know for you it's kind of a weird state right now because your alleged memo has been entered into congressional record. And so my question is simply this: if you were asked to appear before Congress under oath, would you willingly do that? Would you testify?
I would have to get advice from a lawyer first.
Very smart answer.
Very
I'd have to get an advice from a lawyer who has a background in that particular issue and find out what the consequences to me are if I come out and acknowledge it publicly. And because DOD can come after me, and the IC can come after me. They can prevent me from getting a job again by making sure that I don't get my security clearances passed or reactivated if they're suspended because I've been not working in the industry since I got furloughed. So my clearances are still there, but they have a way of making things go away. And what happened to Dave Grush after he filed his whistleblower complaint? It was before he ever testified.
Right.
What happened to Dave Grush is he got harassed and intimidated, both him and his wife. He got harassed by someone in the National Reconnaissance Office, where he had originally worked before he transferred to the NGA. And then he got physically harassed at his home and in his vehicles by people unknown. And then somebody leaked a PTSD episode he had.
Right.
Because remember, he's a war veteran.
Yeah.
And he was in the combat field, and he suffered PTSD and was going through a crisis with his wife. And somebody decides they're going to illegally go into his private medical files, violate the HIPAA law, and release that to the news media so that they can attack his character.
And there are a lot more lawyers at this point on your side, on the UAP Disclosure Fund, and a number of other organizations have spun up to offer pro bono legal support to whistleblowers and people being harassed. Do you feel any better do you feel like it's safer now than it was when Dave came out?
Possibly, I think so.
Yeah.
I just have to have a lawyer tell me, look at the situation, look at the circumstances under which Admiral Wilson gave me information, and then find out if that's something I should do at the level of congressional.
Do you personally think
that was
that?
ironic? Hang on.
Yeah, sorry.
I briefed the Senate Select Committee of Intelligence staff and the Senate Armed Services Committee staff in classified settings, but I never got invited to, and actually the SSCI staff interviewed 2 different staff members. What happened is I briefed the first group in 2019, and then later now we're in 2022, and another group comes out to Huntsville. Instead of me going to DC, they're coming out to see me in Huntsville.
Yeah.
And I'm briefing them. So it's a new group of people, and that was John Estridge. That was John Estridge.
Cited in imminent.
Yeah. So after those events, and after one phone call with Representative Mike Gallagher, Republican representative of his district in Wyoming, so I had a short phone call with him, maybe about 20, 25 minutes. And then I had an interview just last month with the 2 senior staff on the subcommittee that just recently held the House hearings. That Lou Elizondo appeared at.
Yeah, we were there.
So they asked me a lot of questions. They were short on time, so we had a half-hour conversation, and there really should have been a follow-up interview because there were more open questions left to be answered that they didn't have time. They never followed up, and I never got an invite to testify.
Okay.
So, but I have made it known that the only way I'll testify, actually, the reality is in a classified setting.
Well, yeah, I would imagine there's not much slam dunk testimony that can be given in the unclassified venue.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But I'll tell you this, Dave did give the classified testimony, and he gave them everything. He gave them the names and locations and programs and people with the program. I don't even have all that because all I have was the stuff that I accumulated and gathered going up through the OSAP and HIP. And what happened during the UAP ETF was what Jay Stratton was doing then. So I had left that area, and then I had a little bit of stuff going on when I worked for the Aerospace Corporation, and that's how I met Dave Brush.
Right.
Jay Stratton introduced me to Dave and his government customer, who I won't name because he's retired from the government and he doesn't need to, he's not into the UFO field in the sense that he wants to make his identity public. He was a GS-15 at the time, and Dave worked for him, and he got promoted later to SCS-1.
This anonymous individual.
This is the one that Dave worked with at the NRO.
Sure.
And so I briefed them. So they basically invited me through the Aerospace Corporation apparatus, because aerospace is the FFRDC that supports NRO. And so they have a contract, and they flew me out to where they were located in Colorado Springs, and I gave them both briefings, not just them. This included the aerospace personnel that were supporting the NRO office. The NRO was a tenant organization in the aerospace campus there. So we have one building, now it's 2. And in that one building, they have skiffs built in entire floors, and then office suites that are built inside of skiffs that
Sure.
enclose the office suites. So this program that Dave and his government customer worked at was one of those office suites in a skiff. So he's got a lot of, so that GS-15 has a lot of, has a number of aerospace employees supporting his program. Okay. And Dave was doing some aspect of that on the security side as a, because he was an NR, he was one of Jay Stratton's contributors to the UAPTF, because he was the NRO liaison officer to the UAPTF. So anyway, I met both of them, and I gave Dave all my data, all my briefing information, and he took that, ran with it, and found everything.
Yeah.
And then I'm sorry. And then later on, I think maybe a year or 2 later, actually almost 2 years later, somewhere in that period, they finally got to meet with Hal Pitoff, and he briefed them with his set of information. A lot of what he has overlaps mine, but I have a lot of unique information, both in and outside of the era of the 15 years that I worked with Hal. A lot of it came from NIDS, and Hal knew some of that. A lot of it came from AFRL, and then a lot of it came through the OSAP with my interactions with the CIA and other agencies and companies and so forth. So Dave basically ran with our data, mine and Hal's, and found everything. Found 40 witnesses. I'm not going to say who they are, but I can say that I know two of them. Well,
Can you say how many of them are in this building?
I'll say I know that at least only one of them is in the building. And the guy who didn't come to the conference because he had a travel conflict for a prearranged, I think, family trip or something. If he were here, he'd be the second one. And all the rest of them are not here in the building.
Roger that.
Okay, that's what I'll say. And so yeah, there's more to it than that, but I can't discuss it because then I would identify who the two witnesses are.
Understand.
One of the fascinating things that Eric's talking about in the course of his dialogue here is his role in the David Grush release story. Basically, it sounds like Grush came to him at one point, and there was some, divulgences or whatever you want to call it made that sort of helped shape Grush's path. And then also he talks a little bit about his own interaction with various congressional staff contingencies over the last couple of years. What are your thoughts on that? And I mean, is he as formative as he seems based on what he's saying here?
Yeah, I do think that Dr. Davis is a huge part of this. Largely because of those investigations that he did carry out. Throughout I'd say he probably started in earnest in maybe the late 80s, and really carrying forward through NIDS, through the OSAP years as well. And one of the things we find here is he talks about how he met David Grush, which is really interesting. He's acknowledged that before, I think in like Facebook comments, right? Sometimes he'll go on Facebook and make like major revelations, which is always a funny thing. Everybody scrambles to screenshot them and before they get taken down. But to see him in an interview actually talking about this is certainly interesting. And it seems that they really connected at the Aerospace Corporation, which is a federally funded research and development center that supports the NRO. It's essentially a private corporation in a way, but they do service groups like Space Force, NRO. I think they also service the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency on some different things as well, and probably some other Air Force components. But one of the things that's interesting is, Grush has mentioned in his previous framings about his investigation that when he started this, he started to realize that there were people sitting right across the hall from him, right, that he talked to every day, that he realized that they had this other portfolio, this other job, if you will. And now he was learning about this, and so they were able to come forward and talk to him about that. And so it seems that Dr. Davis, right, was probably one of these people. Davis says that at the time that Grush's boss, that he worked with him. And, he also frames it out by talking about how at the Aerospace Corporation, they have these skiffs, which are these facilities that are, you can talk about sensitive information, right? They've got different shielding and there's a lot of times there's white noise and different things that make it.
And one point he says the whole floor there, right, is a skiff, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. So he said they're like whole floor, and so that they're actually there. The NRO was actually there on the Aerospace Corporation campus, and so that's where they kind of meet. And as this investigation starts, he hands him all of this information, which there's no doubt that we've seen a lot of this or seen whispers of it, but he's got to have folders and folders and folders of different things that he's accumulated throughout the years. And so his framing of it, Davis's, is that essentially Grush took this information and he ran with it, right? He went and circled back with some of those sources. He developed new sources and ultimately found 40 witnesses. One of the things I thought was interesting here is that Davis says, I'm not going to say who they are, but I'm going to say I know two of them well. So it does sound almost like he knows most of the witnesses. That's the way I interpret it, but he knows two of them personally well, which I thought was kind of interesting. And he kind of alludes to one of them very astutely. I don't know which interviewer it was, asked which, are any of them here, right? And he said that there's one here, And then there was another one who, was not here for like family vacation reasons. Now, I don't know who was at Seoul because I wasn't there, but you were. My guess would be that at least one of those people would be Carl Nell, who was
Yes,
also working with Dave Grush at one point. Was he at Seoul?
he was absolutely, and
Okay.
he was part of the closing uh, panel. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he's made some comments in the past that he has like 100% confidence or zero doubt, right, that such things are that there are programs and retrievals and things like that. So I that would be my guess. The second question I have for you was Chris Mellon at the
No,
Seoul
he
conference.
wasn't, and he missed the testifying at Congress because of a vacation conflict, which
Yeah.
immediately made me think that maybe that was the second person.
Yeah, yeah, it might be. It might be. So yeah, it's definitely some interesting nuggets in this part of the interview.
So this is huge. It seems like Eric Davis is confirming the Wilson Davis notes, which have driven the conversation. You mentioned it was sort of what got you to write Loose Threads and was the framing of that. And it was really the first time that the crash recovery discussion seemed to have some meat behind it. But there was always the discussion, well, is it fiction? I mean, people thought it was a movie script. There's a long list of, theories about it. But he just basically comes out and says, unless I'm wrong, that he got information from Wilson. He doesn't
Mhm.
say he doesn't point to the notes and say everything that's in there is accurate, but he does say, I got a bunch of information from Wilson. Do I have that right? I mean, that's what I heard.
Yeah, I mean he does, and I think that for me that's particularly exciting and validating. And I know I'm not the certainly not the only one. There's a sort of a tight-knit group of people of I'd say about 10 researchers or so who really really went down the rabbit hole on this and dug up lots of things around it. And they've been rewarded for those efforts, right? They've got a little bit of extra background knowledge. They're ahead of the game when a lot of people who, frankly, wouldn't cover it, right? There are actually some really, even some really good outlets that are publishing other really important pieces that would not touch this story, over, I guess, journalistic ethics or things like that. That being said, there are a lot of other stories that do get published around rumor and smoke and mirrors and with unnamed sources. I mean, this is sort of normal, especially in NatSec reporting and especially with regard to this topic. So I do think that it is interesting not only to look at the document itself, but also the dialogue around the document almost as a case study of when these kinds of bombshell things come out, to sort of look at what is everybody doing, right? Because you can find that you'll find that people have different dispositions in terms of how worried are they about upsetting Admiral Wilson. I think that's really what it comes down to. And there are some people who essentially all but said that. Like to his credit, Lou Elizondo did say, I feel like early on he kind of alluded to that. Jacques Vallée was an early bird to that. He even published something about it in several of his books. And he's not friends with Admiral Wilson. He's not tied into the military industrial context complex in that manner. But it's big. It really is big. I think one of the things to understand if it's such a big deal, why doesn't Davis just, go and give it to Congress, right? He's so willing to talk about other things. Why can't he talk about this? Well, first, the big thing here is, and he sort of hints at this, is that the circumstances under which they met weren't necessarily the circumstances under which you're supposed to meet and talk about these things, right?
That's what I heard, and I also was wondering, does that potentially put Admiral Wilson in jeopardy in some way? I mean, is there illegality here that needs to be considered?
I'm not an expert in such things, but I would certainly think that it's not good.
Yeah.
Not to say that I don't know if it's illegal, but it certainly could be. It could
Yeah.
be. And I think that, the other thing here is, Davis as well, right? Like he's going into this, he's not naively like falling into this vehicle. Like, he knows he's going to talk about, to probably talk about some classified information. He's digging, trying to pull those things out of Wilson, and you can get into a lot of trouble for even unwittingly receiving, classified information. And so, as many NatSec reporters and and even researchers in this space know, you've got to be careful. I'm not making any sort of a ethical statement about it. I'm very glad that he had this meeting. Obviously, it's just there are some legal concerns here. Not only that, you also have to look in the notes themselves. We're not just talking about putting Wilson in hot water potentially. There are several other high-level members of the intelligence community that are named as having helped or assisted Wilson in his search. Some of those people were actually on some of the committees that would eventually, or the sort of internal core group that would basically stiff arm him. Some of those people actually helped him find the program, right? If it had been just up to them, maybe he would have gotten in. But there were at least three different people there, within the. I think one of them was an undersecretary of defense. There were some high-level staffers as well, but there were names, let's just say. So you're not just burning one person, you're burning potentially 5 to 10 other people, including Bill Perry, right? Like, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, kind of a legend. He's in that document as well. And so it's just a lot of baggage. And I think that Davis's hesitance and reticence to talk about it from that perspective is a good instinct, right? You would be making a lot of people very unhappy, which then goes to inform, why are people not talking about this? Well, it's because if you're a NatSec reporter, you depend on, right, the national security apparatus to be willing to talk to you. So
exactly,
that's one of the inherent problems, with that sector of media is you have to sort of play their game by their rules, or you don't get invited to play at all, right?
Exactly. And when they are ready to let something go, they'll call you up, and if you're not on their list, you won't, and that's a big scoop oftentimes.
Yeah,
It's sort of
absolutely.
kind of a pay to play thing with information, and I mean it's endemic in media in general. I mean, even on a local level, like where I usually work, city council. If you make a city councilman angry, he's not going to come to you with whatever story he has. And you have to balance, well, accountability versus like, I want to be the one that they call, and how you do that is shapes what your, reputation is, and how well you get the scoops. But
yeah.
So another interesting thing here that I think I'd like to piggyback on this one was the Eric saying that David Grush gave Congress everything, and we're like, it seems like they were thwarted at the Grush hearing, where it was like, oh, we got to meet in a skiff, and oh, you can't have a skiff. Well, then I can't give you the information. So publicly, it was left at the point where I have all this information, but I can't really give it to you. And so that's where a lot of skeptics have kind of been hanging their hat, like, well, he never provided anything. Well, Davis is saying he provided all of it: names, locations, everything you could possibly want to Congress. He doesn't specify which aspect of Congress, which makes me think maybe it was the armed services staffers or Senate intelligence people, which wouldn't filter down to congressional committees on the other side of the building. But what was your thought on that? I mean, if they know, why aren't they knocking down the doors? Why isn't this blown wide open? Shouldn't it be?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it should be. One of the issues here is sort of this logistical issue of, congressmen they don't attend every meeting, right? They send staffers. And the other thing too is it's possible a lot of times these staffers, I think sometimes when I think of staffer, the first thing I think of is like an intern or something, right? Someone who gets coffee, but that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times they will hire staffers who are, long-term, specialists in certain areas. And so, these are people who have security clearances and are trusted to sort of handle these information and to pass up information when they deem that it is time to do that. And so I think that there's and this isn't just an issue in Congress, right? Like we find out here in other areas that there are people who just they don't know the information. The people who you expect would know the information, the top people that you and I know about, they don't have all of that information. It's their staffers who take those meetings. And there is also, even though they are members of Congress, they don't want to have to lie about things either. And so the sort of the no, don't tell me kind of situation applies really at all levels, but especially when it comes to elected members of Congress, right? So I think that's one really frustrating topic too. And then you get into the situation, well, he told the staffers of this group, right? But now you have different people who've come in. Do their staffers know? Like, how does that happen? Is there a handoff? I don't personally know that. Probably there's not.
Especially if they switch parties. I mean,
Yeah,
absolutely not. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, no one is the Department of Defense and the intelligence community are not like knocking down their door to give them this information. So they're only getting it if they know, oh, I've got to get the backstory about there's this thing that's been going on, and oh, there's this hearing, and oh, I need to go and call them back in to tell me again. I mean that there are just a lot of logistical reasons why this may be the case. And the other thing is maybe just plain Jane politics, right? That it's that it's not in the Overton window, right? Is that what it's called, the Overton window, right? It's not there yet at the level that maybe we hope that it is. I think it's nearing that, but it just may be that it's not a high priority.
Yeah, which is so aggravating to all of us who chase after every morsel of this stuff, but they are dealing with a lot of other issues, obviously, and with the changing administration coming up, I mean, it's going to be even more not the primary interest of Congress, I think. But I mean, it is frustrating to think that there are different staffers and different parts of committees that are hearing things, but there's not necessarily one perspective that's collating all that stuff and building that narrative, which I think is absolutely necessary in something like this, because there are so many facets that unless you know that complex, line of development of all of this, you're really never going to get the whole story, because everyone's only got little pieces, and that's on purpose, the whole siloing aspect of it.
Well, maybe that's the argument for the UAP caucus that they're trying to set up. I know a lot of people will see that, and especially may see the people involved in that and roll their eyes. But if that becomes a place to make those connections and ensure kind of continuity of the investigation, then I'm all for it. I try not to operate under ideology when it comes to this subject, because it is one of the very few subjects. One of the most startling things about it and significant things about it from a political standpoint is that it is nonpartisan. Now, don't get me wrong; they will do everything that they possibly can to make it partisan.
Yeah.
And
they'll
there
drop
have been
little
some attempts.
bombs and stuff. Yes, absolutely.
There to tie it in, the left will tie it into right-wing conspiracy theories, and the right will tie it into left-wing conspiracy theories, and there will be people, they know. I always say that the intelligence community knows how to be all things to all men, right? They know how to if they're not going to get you with the hero, they'll get you with the villain, right? Like they know how to play good cop, bad cop. They know how to, frame these conversations in ways that you stop paying attention.
Yeah, exactly right. And if you have Congress people that are every 2 years, they're either getting challenged or thrown out, or, I mean, all you have to do is wait. And that's been coming up a lot. It's like if you just put it off and put it off and put it off, eventually the interest will change. The people who are investigating will go away, and then you win the secrecy battle.
That's right. That's right.
So yesterday you made some pretty remarkable statements on kind of finding evidence of legacy programs while working at OSAP. And you mentioned that under Eisenhower, PEADS's presidential emergency action documents were kind of used to create Wade special access programs free from congressional oversight. I wanted to see, during your time investigating legacy programs, did you encounter other kind of unique classification standards like no foreign national, excluded program material for these programs kind of dealing with
those are kind of routine. Yeah, those are not new or unusual. There's known SCI compartments, SCI being sensitive compartmentalized information. But there's hidden SCI compartments, and that's what a lot of the American public is not aware of. That's not talked about a lot. And then there's the special access programs, and you've got 4 types. You've got regular SAPs, just special access program. Then you'll have a waived special access program, you'll have an unacknowledged one, and then you'll have a waived unacknowledged one. And actually, I'm not sure that the two in the middle are separate, really. I think more likely it's waived and unacknowledged at the same time. So that might be just a third category, or it's even just a second category. So Dave and I had a lot of discussions. I went through, when I was at Aerospace, I went through special access program security training. So I could qualify to be, it's not that I wanted to qualify to be a security officer, I just wanted to qualify to indicate to the company and the government customers that I'd gone through that level of training comparable to what security officers for special access programs have. And so that would help my eligibility to get access more than anything. And that didn't happen, I didn't get it, but I did do the training. So Dave and I talked about that as a consequence. And I said, Dave, it seems like these hidden SCIs are no different than SAPs. And so that's when he said, yeah, really, they've been having that argument among the security personnel, security experts throughout the IC and the DoD. They've been having an argument for some significant period of time over really whether there is a real distinction between a hidden SCI and an SAP. Most of the people like Dave and I actually came to the conclusion that SAPs are just the same thing as a hidden SCI. And that's kind of like a little nuance in the culture of that aspect of
Yeah, I've heard about this. Yeah.
Acronyms drive me crazy, and this subject is rife with acronyms. But one of the things that was really interesting in this conversation is how they discuss the various programs that are responsible for keeping things secret. You have SAPs versus, I guess, hidden SCIs, which I wasn't quite sure with how that, what that was or how it relates. Although I imagine it means special compartmented information. At least that's what SCI generally means. And then there's PEDS, which is, I guess, a White House version of this. Can you give us some clarity as much as you can around what these various acronyms represent and how they relate to each other?
Yeah, so the SAP is a special access program, and essentially what that means is that it's a program that has a security wrap around it, and there's a list of people, right, who are able to access that special access program. That's why it's special access, right? And if you're not on the list, right, you don't get briefed on that, right? You have to have a direct need to know. You've got to be able to make a case that, for the purposes of your program or, some national security reason that you have to know. And so the PEDS, on the other hand, are documents. They're presidential emergency action documents. And what these do is these allow the president to sort of create future, unacknowledged special access programs in the event that a certain criteria is met, usually some kind of emergency or dire situation. So a lot of these early PEDS are probably created around in the Cold War, around the nuclear issue. And so I think the implication here with what Davis is talking about is that some of these programs were set up as with these PEDS, that later on you could sort of activate this PED, well, this criteria has been met, now we can set up this special access program under the authority of the president, even if the president's no longer the president anymore, like you can,
wow.
They're kind of like standing standing documents. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's the way it works, and once one is created, the president doesn't necessarily know, the next president doesn't necessarily know, and so this is a way to sort of stack the deck to ensure that you have that you're preserving secrecy regardless of who's in the White House. These but yet you still have that presidential authority. And so I think that's really how they connect there, One sort of begets or creates the other.
I think something a lot of people don't ask that has kind of captured my attention. During your time investigating legacy programs, did you see much collaboration or compartmentalization between programs that may exist in Navy, Air Force, Army?
It's two stovepipe or compartmentalized. You can't open it up to another one unless there is a need to do that. And that need to get access is defined on a government form called the DD-254. And the DD-254 documents who has access and why and what gets access. And if you're going to have to get access to another compartmentalized program, then that has to be justified in the DD-254. And usually that's not justified because programs don't really overlap. However, I think it was Bill Sweetman back in the 1980s who did a deep dive in this after Reagan became president. And he did correctly say that the compartmentalization of SCIs, but mostly SAPs, was really horrible because you end up duplicating programs.
Right.
So you'll have more than one program doing the same thing. So we're now spending taxpayers' dollars at twice the magnitude doing the same thing between two programs, and they can't communicate that to each other. Yeah, they can't collaborate. They can't come to an understanding of say, hey, oh yeah, you exist. Oh, and you exist, and what you're working on is what we're working on, but we're spending all the government's money this way. Why don't we join forces and maybe cut the budget and, and be more effective and efficient with the expenditure? But that isn't what happens. You can't do that.
You actually sent me the article, the Liberation Times piece that Chris Sharp wrote about just recently.
Yeah, I read it, but I didn't remember all the details.
That's all right. You have to comment. He was
I
detailing.
read it. It was a good piece.
Yeah, he was kind of describing for I think the first time some of the intimate details of the ecosystem of the program eponymously, and that was where I heard for the first time that DOE and then what was it called, Office of Weapon or CIA Weapons Counter-Proliferation Mission
right.
Center,
Now called WINPAC.
That's the modern name of WINPAC, the Weapons Intelligence, Nuclear Proliferation and Arm Control.
Yeah.
I actually got hired by the CIA to be the branch chief scientist.
No kidding.
Scientist of WINPAC back in late 2003.
Wow. Yeah, so they talked about how DOE, that group, and a bunch of combatant commands all do their own thing to some extent, and there's really not an executive head, adjudicating conflicts or duplicate work like you're saying. You could have Navy programs and Air Force programs doing the same thing.
Okay. Keep in mind that it's called the Counter-Proliferation Program, right? And WINPAC are actually multi-agency. They're not just the CIA. They're CIA, NSA, NRO, this and that, DIA, most likely. Because when I got hired, the hiring manager that was going to be my boss did a briefing with me to debrief me on what my job duties were going to be, what organizations were involved, and that I was going to interface with all these organizations. And he wrote down two lists on a couple columns. They weren't that long, but they were all the agencies that were fused together to run the WINPAC operation.
Sure. Yeah.
So WINPAC will seek resources and personnel from that agency, this agency, and that agency to accomplish different things.
I think one WINPAC member recently mentioned kind of as a gatekeeper of legacy programs was Glenn Gaffney.
Yes.
If you guys remember that from various reporting, I think Chris Sharp touched on it as well.
Did you ever interact with Glenn Gaffney?
I didn't have direct interaction with them, but the aerospace defense firm that we were trying to work with during the OSAP had direct interaction with them, as well as he was a senior VP, and the executive VP of the corporation had to have a conversation with Glenn Gaffney.
Yeah.
And he was very antagonistic about that company releasing to us under the DIA
To NIDS.
Huh?
To NIDS, right?
To us, no, to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies and ERTEC.
Right.
To release to us their collection of crash retrieval materials that they've had since before it got shut down in '89. Going back, I don't have no idea how far it went back. So he stepped right in the middle of it. First, he was surprised that that company still retained materials that when they were supposed to give it up and return it back in '89.
No kidding.
And then he said his answer to that whole question about giving permission for them to share it with us under that classified setting, because that was SAP level, we were TSSCI. We were trying to get SAP, and Harry Reid was trying to get Deputy Secretary of Defense William Lynn to give us an SAP, and William Lynn denied his request. And the reason why he denied it is because Harry Reid was using political muscle, and you can't do that. It has to go through the security channels and the program management to create a justification and a need to give a program that's already TSSCI a SAP level. Okay, add-on SAP.
Politics.
Yeah, so he's looking at, I can understand what William Lynn is looking at. He's getting interference from a member of the Senate, absolutely, who happens to be the majority leader. So the majority leader of the Senate is telling him, I want you to, in a very nice letter, the letter's been posted on the internet. So very nice letter saying, well, we have reason that we need to do this, et cetera, et cetera. And Lynn didn't buy it because that wasn't an official channel for how you create a SAP. A program that's already TSSI and elevated up to a SAP. There's a whole process, procedure, bureaucracy, and red tape that you have to go through. And Harry was using political muscle to bypass all that. And the executive branch is taught or trained not to do that because Capitol Hill is not their taskmaster. The taskmaster is the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, the head of the executive branch. Now, who was the president at that? It was Bush. So George W. Bush, if Harry Reid had written the letter to Bush or actually met him face-to-face, which would have been far more effective. I don't know how possible it would have been, but it would have had a much higher chance that Bush would call down to William Lynn, or he would have maybe his National Security Advisor, Stephen Hadley, call the Secretary of Defense's office, actually, and maybe the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, and say, okay, there's this program, I want it to get a SAP.
Sure.
And if the president says, I want a SAP, they're going to have to SAP it.
For sure.
Yeah, and it's extremely interesting. I'll name drop this. So, in Lou Elizondo's book, he specifically mentions how, they went to Lockheed Martin to see if they could, get inside the program and have some of this material, and they were pretty much, blocked out by the program manager and, of course, the red tape and the bureaucracy.
Well, Glenn Gaffney was the director of the, he was the director. I think his title was Deputy Director of the CIA over the Directorate of Science and Technology. And that's where the UFO or the UAP portfolio is held. So he's the portfolio owner at the time he was there. So I guess maybe his title is Deputy Director of Science and Technology. It depends on how they organize it those days. But anyway, that's what he ran that directorate. So he just stepped in the middle and just said, absolutely not, we're not going to do that. So
there's a ton of contractors that are involved in these issues, and Davis was involved in some, and there's a lot that have been named throughout the hearings and everything else, and a lot of them come up in this conversation. Do you think that from what we're hearing here, are we any closer to sort of zeroing in on which contractors are the most vital to this hidden secret world around UAPs, or is it still pretty murky?
Well, I think that there's two levels to the conversation, right? I think that Davis is taking us to this top level, and and this really actually gets back to the Wilson Davis notes, where Wilson didn't actually just find one program; he actually found four, and they were all related to each other. And apparently these are sort of like these four different related aspects. And sure enough, Davis says that there are four different contractors that are involved with this work. Now, most of the conversation, especially if you're paying attention to UFO X or these kinds of things, they're focused on Lockheed Martin.
Yeah.
And Lockheed Martin, the reason that's become the focus is because they were the contractor that was actually involved with trying to transfer material to the OSAP, right, to Bigelow Advanced Aerospace, um, uh, Bigelow's space company, if you will, right, under the OSAP contract. And so one of the interesting things here, though, that you'll find is that it actually wasn't Lockheed that stiff-armed that process. It was actually a member of the CIA. Or not,
Yes.
it was actually the CIA who blocked that, but there were actually people at Lockheed who wanted to transfer this technology over. And so sometimes I don't ever want to plead anybody's case, especially when it comes to the military industrial complex, but I think sometimes Lockheed gets a little bit more attention than maybe they deserve on some of these things. And a lot of it comes down to also with Skunk Works and, being a fixture at Area 51 and things like that. They tend to get a lot of attention, but they are not the only, group that's involved in this, right? He also talks about, right, TRW is actually one of the more, the legacy of programs that that he discusses that has been out there for a little bit, connected, in fact, to the group at the Wilson Davis notes. A lot of people have speculated that perhaps that was TRW, the program that, or the program managers that he spoke to that Wilson found were actually at TRW. He also talks about, he doesn't name it, but he says that, one of them spun off from TRW in 1960. Well, that's the Aerospace Corporation, right? That's his former employer. That's an FFRDC that, it's very, you have to love Davis for this. I don't know that I didn't hear him say Lockheed, but I did. The way he talks about it's obvious, right? He's going up to the line and not crossing over it, which I appreciate. So yes, he mentions Lockheed Martin an awful lot. And he does also, it seems to me that a lot of his information does actually come filtered from the senior vice president at Lockheed Martin, who was involved in making this push. And that there were briefings. He was probably, as part of the OSAP, he was in the middle of some of those briefings, and he's getting information from their perspective of sort of the timeline of this program. And so one of the things I wanted to point out here is that there are, if you want to look at, there's a physicist whose name is Bernard Heisch, and he, I wouldn't call him a member. I guess he might be a member of the Invisible College. I think you could call him that. He's at least a colleague of all of the various members, and he actually put out a statement in 2018 on his blog called UFO Skeptic, which said that a group of 4 related but separate unacknowledged SCI programs tracing back to a 1947 Truman Memorandum still exist and were housed as of the 1990s in major aerospace companies, such as, for example, Lockheed, TRW, Raytheon, and the Aerospace Corporation. And so, we have...
That's consistent with what he's saying here, right?
That's
yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
That's right. And then the only one missing is Raytheon. And Raytheon has, been in joint ventures with Lockheed and is a frequent collaborator with these different groups. Now, that being said, I do not personally believe that these are the 4. They kind of ask him, is this it? Are there more? I personally think that there are a lot more, just from my own, diving into things. Some groups that are not named that I think are certainly probably involved are, SAIC historically. Now, there's a spinoff called Leidos. They're probably involved. BDM is a historical company that we looked at, Braddock, Dunn, and McDonald, as part of our work and research. They're definitely, involved to some extent. And, especially those 2, he mentioned something called the Beltway Bandits, right? And that's a really important distinction there, because you have regular sort of contractors, right, that manufacture things, they make things. But then you have the Beltway Bandits, right, like a BDM and SAIC. And these they don't actually manufacture things, right? These are logistics and services companies. And so what they offer is expertise, right? What they offer is, they will essentially, they can be sort of the glue between these various contractors. They can be somebody that contractors want to work with to some extent because they know they're not going to take their trade secrets. They're not right because they are not going to benefit from the manufacturing of anything, right? And so those groups, like I said, they were called the Beltway Bandits. Their whole business model was essentially having cushy relationships. That was their whole thing. They'd hire, 100 different vice presidents so that you were always in a meeting with the vice president, and it helps to sort of grease the wheels on these things. And so I do think that there is a lot of activity that does coalesce, especially around SAIC. BDM was actually acquired by TRW, and TRW was acquired by Northrop Grumman. And so, and in terms of other major contractors, I do think that people should not sleep on Boeing as well. There's primarily because of a McDonnell Douglas connection, right? There is Douglas was going back to, one of the oldest and largest defense contractors. There's a lot of meat on the bone, and there are a lot of, I would even say, even beyond defense, strictly defense contractors. I think, there's been talks about Monsanto. There's been talks about, some other groups as well. And so I think there will be some surprising connections made, in the coming years about who's involved and who's not involved. But I do think that there's, there probably are sort of these, what he calls principal investigators or principal contractors that they're sort of subcontracting out these different things. One of the things that I thought was very interesting is that he talks about that this program supposedly ended in 1989, or this thing that Lockheed Martin was involved in ended in 1989.
Yeah.
And apparently, though, they had kept that equipment, they'd kept that material all the way until the OSAP years.
Yeah.
So it really does beg the question, right? Even though at that point the CIA did stiff arm, right, the process, between then and now, right, between then and the OSAP years, I mean, that's almost 20 years, right? 15, 20 years. Who was determining what was going on with that material in government, right? Like, who is the person who's saying, we lent this to you, we're supposed to get it back. That's fine, you can just hang on to it. Because it does seem like the officer at the CIA who's involved in that conversation was almost surprised that they still had that. Yeah. So that goes to that continuity thing, right? And there being some issues there. But I do think that that's something that should be dug into for sure, that 1989 year. I think that one of the things that's interesting, that's also the year that the Berlin Wall fell, right? It's also the year that, around the same time period that a man named Bob Exler, who we write about in the Wilson Davis, in Loose Threads, had a meeting with a very high level, former government official, Bobby Ray Inman, and gets kind of taken on a cosmic journey, if you will, where he meets people who tell him that they have a craft, right? And there are bodies, and should we show people these craft and bodies and things like that? It's also around the same time that Mark McCandlish, who does get mentioned here later, I'm sure we'll talk about, is told by a friend that he attended a air show where they were shown these three supposedly reverse engineered vehicles. And so one wonders if 1989, with the Cold War winding down or seemingly winding down, if there was some sort of a decision made to maybe start doing some technology transfer, to start, whether it's changing hands between contractors, or maybe also to the public, It's possible that those incidents were completely unrelated. It's also possible that they were genuine attempts. I don't rule that out. And it's also, of course, possible that they're related to security around some of these transfers, that you want to kind of muddy the water before you pass off this material. It's also the year that Bob Lazar came out as well. There's a lot of stuff that happens in 1989 that I think it's a crucial year, especially with Dr. Davis sort of learning from the Lockheed folks that was apparently the time when the program was sort of halted or shuttered for lack of progress.
I wanted to make a quick point. One of the things that we've been hearing about through various books and ideas is that there's like almost a how would you describe it? A breakaway civilization where there's a more different knowledge and different levels of like understanding about what the cosmic picture is for humanity. There's a level of privilege there that outstrips what the average American has. And if what you're describing is true, where all of these corporations have a piece of this. And so all of them have a level of knowledge about what's actually going on at root in our universe and whether or not we're alone. That level of, information provides advantages, and who knows what has come out of all the reverse engineering stuff. It creates a picture of a kind of a stilted society where there are, there's access to information going on that, conveys advantages that's unfair to the rest of us and says something kind of bleak about where we're at as a country. That's just commentary, but
no,
it's like
I think you're one of the things I've reflected lately as I've dug into some of these newer revelations is that not only are they is there necessarily a breakaway civilization? I think it was Richard Dolan maybe who was the person who wrote about that initially. I think that these people manage our reality to some extent,
yes,
right?
absolutely.
I do think that there's even if we're just talking about conventional technologies, like there is a schedule in place, right? And I think that a lot of times this group that we follow, right, the Invisible College, they're almost trying to get the intelligence community, the military industrial complex to go to accelerate their schedule, right? Which in that sense, I agree with them. Let's accelerate the schedule, right? But I do think that there, not to sound too conspiratorial, I think that there is a schedule, and I do think that a lot of what we're seeing today may be related to not necessarily who knows and who has access and can we collaborate. It's the schedule. And, there have even been some instances where, some of these contractors and things they were involved in were actually admonished by the GAO for trying to do some technology transfer before they'd reached maturity, right? Certain technologies. Other terms to think about are, technological surprise, right? We always want to avoid technological surprise. Well, that's something that's there from a national security standpoint. But one thing to realize is that the intelligence community has always factored in the economy to national security. Right. That's always been in fact, it's one of their, it's a huge deal, right. For them. And so they do factor in, they think about, right, like what would this, particular, technology transfer, how that might impact the US economy or the global economy, right. Those things factor in. And so, personally, my own perspective is that we're getting to a point where Bert, tear up the schedule, right? Tear up the schedule.
Yeah, exactly right. We've reached such a
I
level
don't
of
care where it came from.
Yeah,
Let's get it out. Like, I don't care how you did it or who did what or didn't have what. Like, that can all be worked out. Let's start transferring some of this technology, which I'm sure we'll have some more time to talk about because Davis does make some statements about that as well.
Yeah, it's the time for the life rafts has come. Like, we need to get everything in the water, or bad things may end up happening.
You made a brief discussion on stage about which presidents knew how much. I wonder, HW, former director of CIA, do you think it stands to reason that HW might have known more than many other modern presidents by virtue of his CIA
I had
post?
conversations with him back in 2003, and what he learned, he was not briefed as a president on this subject. He was briefed as an incoming CIA director.
Not surprised.
And that's all he had on it. When he became president, he didn't hear about it anymore. When he was the CIA director, he was given some pretty spectacular information, and he insisted that he wanted to see that. This is DoD information. What's funny is that his agency was the portfolio owner for UAPs, so even he wasn't told who in the CIA was running it for him to get briefed by, for him to call on his phone and say, "I need you to brief me." He wasn't told. Instead, it was the Pentagon liaison officer who had no intention on briefing him about UFOs or UAPs, and instead he assumed that Bush had already been briefed by his CIA personnel or his leadership,
Sure.
who oversee that portfolio. And he actually assumed that. He started rattling off about a major UAP event that took place in the early 60s. And Bush's eyes lit up, and this is what he told me. He said, "What are you talking about?" So the Pentagon liaison officer told him all about it. He said, "Are you kidding me? There's a there?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Absolutely." And he said, "Well, I want to see the evidence." And the evidence was in the form of a film, and some documentation, reports or something, but the film was the primary thing, and he was declined. The liaison officer said, "No, you don't have a need to know, because this is DoD intelligence, and we're not going to give it to you. Only if there's an event that happens that requires you to take
Like you
that
were saying.
information up to the president and the national security, actually go to the national security advisor. He's the clearinghouse for all things UAP. So you go to the president's national security advisor and you say, my agency just had a major event that we collected intelligence on, and it's going to require a presidential decision.
Broadly speaking, do you have
Hang
any?
on, hang on. So they're gonna have to go up
Yeah.
to the national security advisor, tell them that, and the national security advisor is gonna have to say, okay, here's a number in your agency who you're gonna call to get a full briefing on the whole UFO thing.
Jeez.
And meanwhile, I'll schedule a meeting in the Oval Office with the president. That's how that works.
Yeah.
And I think the P documents could possibly emerge from that. If it's a historical thing, no. That historical event might already be covered by a P. And that's probably why that guy, that briefing officer, the liaison officer for the Pentagon, actually slipped up by wrongly assuming that Bush was already briefed. The fact is yes, you can brief the P within the executive branch, but he assumed that Bush had been, and he hadn't been. So my guess is that since that was not a new event, it was an old historical event, that there'd be no need to brief Bush on the P that was involved, so he would never know. He would just hear about the evidence that recorded that event happening, and it happened at a military base. And so there you go.
One of the assumptions I think that we all make is that, or at least a lot of us make, is that if you're president, and especially if you're a president who has history in the intelligence community, you're going to be wired in to the important secrets. But one of the things that comes up here, according to Davis, is George H.W. Bush, the first one, senior, wasn't briefed as president on the programs. He had some knowledge based on some stuff he'd learned as CIA director, but not as president. He did say, though, that there was like some sort of misunderstanding at one point about who had briefed him and who didn't. And so that was sort of confusing. But I mean, if you're a president, can't you just demand the information? Maybe not.
Well, it's been tried, right?
Yeah.
You know, Carter tried it. Clinton also
Clinton
tried it as
yeah.
well. There's been a lot of, you know, several different attempts to get information that were rejected, right? You know, in Carter's instance, it was rejected by NASA. I mean, if you can't get information from NASA, then I don't, you're right. It's, you know, maybe the president isn't as powerful as we think he is, you know, or she is. And so I think that, you know, there is, you know, in theory, yes, the president should be able to do all of these things. But the reality is that it just doesn't play out that way.
Like you were saying before, they're elected officials. I mean, and I think people who are military careerists are like, he's going to come, he's going to go, she's going to come, she's going to go.
Mhm.
And so can they be trusted? You know?
Yeah, and I think probably the way you can sort of determine who is in the know versus maybe who isn't in the know is to look at their National Security Council, right? Are the members of their National Security Council intelligence community lifers? Are they people that have been members of the National Security Council for decades, right? In the case of George H.W. Bush, yeah. In the case of George W. Bush, yeah, right? Reagan, right? These guys, their National Security Council, these guys were connected to the NSC back during the Nixon administration. I mean, even Rumsfeld and oh shoot, I'm blanking on a name here. Anyway, Rumsfeld, right, he starts back in the Nixon administration as well, and so you have Kissinger is somebody who comes up a lot in conversations around the legacy program and movers and shakers, and especially as goes the National Security Council. Like if you've got people that are connected even back in those days to sort of the executive, you've got a lot of weight there, right? And a lot of time that's elapsed where they've maybe had reason to be read into these programs. And so I think in one of the interesting things is that Davis he says that the NSC is actually the clearinghouse for a lot of this. And so I do think it's interesting though, because not every NSC is the same, right? People swap in and swap out, so there has to be some kind of continuity there somewhere, and it seems to exist within middle management, right? It seems not to exist at the top. It's not even as the head of the CIA, as DCI, George H.W. Bush was not briefed, as you said, right? He was accidentally briefed by someone who was a Pentagon liaison officer, right? This is not somebody who's at the top level, right? They have the top level security clearances, but they're not a household name likely that you would know, which is a good thing, right? Because if you don't know who they are, you can't subpoena them and bring them into Congress. We've learned, certain people even have reported that people involved in the oversight of Aero have actually refused briefings on the subject because they know if they take those briefings, then they won't be able to go to Congress and act like they're completely uninformed on the topic. Like Ronald Moultrie, for instance. And so I think that the Secretary of Defense, unless the Secretary of Defense, and some of them have been working their way through middle management for a long time and have served as undersecretaries, served as staffers in different offices, they might know. But if there's somebody who maybe doesn't have those connections, those kind of like long kind of middle management, work your way up the ladder, they might not ever be briefed on these kinds of things. So, yeah, I think and I think the other thing that's interesting is it's not without precedent either. Like there's a big CIA, there have been several CIA reports about UFOs that have been generated, at the request of the DCI, right? Clapper, James Clapper requested that. There's also a famous incident where it was an admiral. I'll remember his name in a minute. He saw basically what happened is some stories came out in the New York Times about I think the agency was being sued under FOIA, and he basically said, "Hey, like, are we in UFOs? Like, what's going on here?" And there were even internal kind of communications where he's trying to figure out, like, "Hey, is this a thing? Is this actually a thing?" And so you think that these guys have all this information and they just don't, right? It just doesn't work like that. It does seem that George H.W. Bush, once he was briefed, did get a lot of information. And he was probably in a pretty good position to receive a lot of information because of the makeup of his National Security Council.
Yeah.
Although Davis does say that he didn't receive information as president, he received it when he was, head of the Central Intelligence Agency. But at the same time, those can that's basically the same group of people, right? The people who were on the NSC when he was going to the NSC meetings then, and the people who are the NSC when he's president, and are heading up these intelligence agencies. They're all his kind of close confidants, and they are people who've been rumored to be very, very, very involved in this UFO control group, if there is such a thing, right? If there's a group of powerful people who sort of from a high level orchestrate some of this. A lot of those people kind of circulate around the George W. Bush administration, right? Especially like Dick Cheney, Bob Gates,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Rumsfeld. All these people have been named by, I think the earliest, Stephen Greer, someone people don't like to talk about a lot. He's somebody who has talked about Dick Cheney and talked about these people as being sort of central to, to secrecy around this subject.
Well, and the Bush name goes all the way back, though, right? I mean, even with Vannevar from the MJ-12 legend,
Yeah.
you wouldn't think that he would be divulging it to his family members, but who knows?
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of those PEDs, yesterday you also made some super interesting comments on kind of private contracts. Specifically, I think you said source contracts.
Sole source. Sole source means instead of putting out a project up for a contract bid,
An RFP.
yeah, you have to issue either a broad area announcement, which is how Bigelow Aerospace applied to submit a bid for the OSAP contract. Okay, hang on. So it's either a request for proposals or a broad area announcement. And if you do that, then you're going to severely compromise the security of an SAP. So they don't do that. You don't invite different companies to see the specs of the program, the outline and the specs and the deliverables expected over the period of performance expected in the RFP or the BAA. Instead, the government agency has the contract guy and the program manager guy and maybe one other authority over all that. They're gonna call up their favorite contractor who they know or believe could successfully execute the project. And they'll say, okay, we want to give you a contract, here's how much money, and here's how many years we're going to pay you. And the company's stupid, they'll say no. If the company's smart, they'll say yes. And generally, the Beltway bandits and the legacy aerospace industry are not stupid. They need money, so they will always say
Would
yes.
those be authorized contracts then, or have a transfer of authority? Those sole source contracts, would they be traceable?
No, usually they set up a front company to pass the money through.
Yeah.
So this roster of kind of the big defense contractors for these big projects, would that roster be pretty thin? Only a couple entries there? And
I don't know. But I do know from the aerospace company that I interacted with quite frequently during the OSAP, they did go to the government customer. It wasn't always the CIA, it was Air Force at times. So I think the money is transmitted through a pass-through company, but they know very well who their government customer is. The government customer knows very well who they are and that they have a contract. So I think the fact that the money goes through a hard-to-audit channel doesn't prevent the two from talking, because the program does get contract monitoring and contract oversight from the government customer. So they will exert that authority over the project.
And
I wanted to ask you about Dave Grush's IRAD fraud allegations. Do you recall what he talked about in Congress? He alleged that at least one contract, and I believe Elizondo repeated it in his House hearing actually, the allegation was made that at some point in time, for some duration, a contractor artificially inflated the proposal budget for a black budget program so that they could siphon that money off into IRAD to do an IRAD project, because frequently you can tax deduct the funding for the profit dollars and move them. And instead of just hoping they overperformed, they doctored the situation so that they definitely overperformed, and the extra money was sort of moved into this.
Okay, I don't have any insights on that.
Okay.
Okay, and There are two types of contracts. It's either cost plus fee or fixed
Fixed
cost.
firm price.
Fixed firm price, yeah. So those are the only contract vehicles I'm aware of. I'm not aware that there's anything special just because of UAPs. So it's either cost plus or firm cost, firm fixed price.
Sure.
And I think one of those is how NASA tends to issue contracts. Like Artemis is way over budget, over schedule, and the Orion heat shield did the same thing to the Orion. Boeing has become a disaster with the CST-100 or this.
Yeah.
What was it?
Starliner.
Starliner, yes.
Yeah.
So that is under cost plus.
Right.
And that's where the government gets screwed on. So I have no idea what contract vehicles are used for UAP. It's like now you're down in the weeds and it really doesn't matter. So.
Sure.
Well, speaking of these sort of corporate entities here, people are sort of aware that, okay, maybe they have their groups to do this reverse engineering, to do this material analysis, what have you, in their programs. But is there any merit to there being private strike teams who are having their own contested crash recoveries with the public strike teams?
No, I'm not familiar with any. I haven't heard any such thing, even out in the open. Even in the classified venue, I haven't heard.
There's a story of apparently a private military contractor, contracted by Lockheed Martin, sent out to recover a crash, and a JSOC team sent out to the same crash site, and they're apparently being exchanged of fire and KIAs, and clearly this would generate a lot of paper, right?
Wow, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah.
incident. Okay.
What about, so all this talk about private contractors, the big Lockheed Martin, what about federally funded research and development centers, such as MITRE, RAND, Triad, Oak Ridge, and UARCs, University Affiliated Research Centers? Where do they fall into this?
Only one, and I won't name it, started out as a contractor in the 1960s, starting not too long after it was born. It was actually a spinoff of TRW. So TRW was the principal investigator for the first roughly, almost 30, practically, 29 years. But I know that another company would dispute that. They thought they were a principal contractor. In fact, the principal contractor serves a leadership role that the other companies kind of, they don't know what's going on, but they know who's involved at the, the scuttlebutt level. And so they know at the scuttlebutt level through communications with the government customer who else would be involved. But they don't have direct communications with those other companies because of compartmentalization. Okay, so I do know that there'd be a dispute because there was, the senior VP of the company I interacted with during the OSAP with that. Well, we had the program running and they didn't consider they didn't consider somebody else as the principal investigator. I think they wouldn't know that. The government customer knows that. So I think that's where the misunderstanding was occurring, is down at the company level. So yeah, the only FFRDC I know of is the one that spun off of TRW. And they were involved. And my recollection from the senior vice president of the other company is that they kind of left that whole line of work at some point just because I think they did all they could do. And so they got out of it somewhere maybe 10 a little more years, few more years, longer than 10 years after they got started on it. So probably in the early 70s is when they left it. And then we had the other legacy firms that were involved. So there were 4 overall.
That would make sense because a lot of the FFRDCs that were started kind of were born out of the early 60s, late 50s, and kind of fulfilled their purpose within 10 years and then moved on to other projects. Like RAND, for example, started off as Project RAND.
So one of the interesting revelations that's come out of this to me was the fact that, first off, there were some pretty pedantic reasons why, I mean, Harry Reid was unsuccessful in getting the OSAP access to the information and whatnot, that he did it the wrong way, that as a legislator, he tried to throw his political weight around. And apparently that turned off folks in the executive branch who were like, no, 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 this is our bailiwick and that's not how we play ball. And so that immediately got him off onto the wrong foot. Was that your read there, or what did you think of that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right on. I mean, I think there is, the OSAP was sort of Harry Reid and Daniel Inouye and a few others. This is their baby, right? And they're trying to push this using their weight, right? Using his weight as Senate Majority Leader, to make this happen. And that's just not the way that SAPs are generally formed. And so, there are these bureaucratic hoops, right? And that you've got to suffer through. And the other thing is, like, it's interesting because there's the stated reason, like on the documents, and then there's the real reason, right? And in the documents, it's saying, well, I don't really see the reason why they need an SAP, because none of the things that they're looking at right now are really so sensitive. But they're almost elucidating that, well, maybe if Reed thinks that eventually they're going to come to some sort of discovery that needs to be secured, then, but right now they don't need it. Like, that's all just internal, politics BS, basically. But it does really come down to the fact that he was trying to do something out of order, right? The bottom line is, these security on these programs, they don't want bureaucratic eyeballs on this. They don't want congressional oversight, right? Like, who wants congressional oversight? Like, nobody involved, generally wants that. Very few industries do. And so I think that, that's something, that's definitely a theme to notice. At the same time, you do have the internal, issue where you do have the CIA that's stiff-arming this process, right?
Exactly right. Yeah.
And so the CIA, it's Glenn Gaffney. He's the deputy director for science and technology.
And his name has been a hot item recently, and it seems like he has taken on this persona of being like, the secret personified, kind of the guy who is keeping it all under lock and key. Is he essential to that, as it seems like at this point, or is it?
Well, one of the things that I noticed from Davis's framing was that it seemed, we alluded to this earlier, that he was almost surprised that Lockheed had this material still, even though they were supposed to have handed it over in 1989. So it seems to me like maybe he wasn't, long-term, lifer involved with this kind of information, but that once he became involved, right, he fell in line, right? He did probably what the sort of institutional middle managers would have wanted done as well. And so that goes back to, again, he's the deputy director of science and technology. That's actually a higher level position, right? You oversee a lot of different, programs and departments and offices and things like that. And so it's entirely possible that Glenn Gaffney was not really read into all of this until he absolutely needed to, even as the deputy director of science and technology. In fact, there are even past instances where UFO, intel was actually brought to the CIA, and rather than going to the deputy director of science and technology, it actually went to the assistant deputy director of science and technology, and that's the person who actually kind of knew where this information was supposed to go. And so, even information collected from the public, the domestic collection division, those things would get funneled through to the assistant deputy director of science and technology. So that'd be, somebody actually under Glenn Gaffney. And then, of course, it gets down into the offices where you have people that are over, like the WinPAC, right? He mentions, which is sort of the legacy of the Office of Scientific and Weapons Research, the OSWR. And so, these things, which is actually where, by the way, Kit Green worked, right? And Ron Pandolfi and some of these other people, right? These that are sort of they sometimes are friends of the Visible College, and
Yeah, they're sort of
sometimes they're
tangential to that
they're
group. Yeah,
frenemies, right? They're
yeah,
frenemies. They're very interesting
yeah.
people, very and kind of infamous in certain ways. And this is the group, like they worked for these for this group, right? Like the so-called weird desk. Um, you know, I'm not sure that it was necessarily, a desk, right? There may have been a lot more going on there. And so I think they're, obviously like Glenn Gaffney, I don't know the full story behind his involvement, but it certainly seems that when it was brought to him that he said, yeah, I think it was really funny the way Davis said, he said, we're not going to do that now. So it was very almost like Office Space. I'm going to need you to come in on Saturday kind of a thing. I think that it's very interesting. And that's somebody I'd say bring him out, subpoena him and and kind of, call their bluff, I think is the way to go. And so there's also this mention of sole source contracts, right?
Yes, and
You
that's
know,
been come up a lot, where it almost seemed improper that Bigelow had
right.
the opportunity to bid on the OSAP program, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think it was interesting to hear Davis sort of frame that from a security standpoint. That it makes total sense that you are probably going to go with contractors that you trust, and you're probably not going to be able to put all of the specs and all of the different descriptions of what you're going to be working on when it's so highly classified. How are you going to
exactly.
actually do this? And so, a sole source contract is probably the way this is handled. And, at the same time, there are lots of things that operate that way. A lot of times there are RFPs put out. There are, broad area announcements, they call them sometimes too, like that are put out for these different programs. And there have been instances where corporations or, they're still going to get favoritism, right? I've even found instances where they were actually there, like they were like vice presidents are of some of these contractors are there as they're drawing up this RFP that they're going to, submit for proposals. And there've been people who've been caught by the, GAO, their hands have been slapped and they move on. There's not it's just kind of the normal way of doing business. But in this instance, it actually seems as if there's a true reason, not to
Yeah,
mention the fact that not just that Reed trusted Bigelow, but that Bigelow has at his disposal the Invisible College. He's got this group of investigators and high level
yeah,
people that have connections to the intelligence community. The group at NIDS was actually not put together by Bigelow, it was put together by Colonel John Alexander, right? Who,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
if you can't trust John Alexander, right, then who can you trust? At least in the to be thinking from a national security and a strategic perspective, right? He's the father of non-lethal weapons. Like this is a very well-respected guy. He put together that the NIDS crew, and so and for some reason was not involved with the OSAP effort, or at least not explicitly, which is a very interesting question as to why that's the case. But at the same time, they have Skinwalker Ranch. They've got a
Yeah.
living laboratory. They've got a place to study not just UFOs, but phenomenology, right? To study,
Yeah.
all of the fun and weird things that tend to, go along with UFOs. Now, there are also some contractual, oddities and things like that can be used to hide programs, to fund programs. Davis has asked about those. He's asked about specifically the IRAS, the Independent Research and Development
Yeah.
contracts.
Which
And
is
he
something
doesn't,
Grush had talked about during his hearing, right? There was somehow
right,
it was used fraudulently to cover, if I'm,
right.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I was kind of I thought it was interesting that Davis said he didn't know anything about those. I would be very surprised if he doesn't know about the contract vehicles that are used. You know,
Can
and
you
it's
explain what an
also,
IRAD is for folks? Because
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So with IRAD, the way it works is essentially you're not actually contracted to do anything. But if you, let's say I'm a contractor and I say, I think that if I were to do research on this kind of capability or this, the government might feasibly be interested in this. I can go and I can fund it, right, from my own funds. And then later I can come in and say, basically claim it, right? Not as like a tax write-off, but like as a you can get reimbursements and refunds from
so like
this.
basically, if you can come in and prove that that's going to be advantageous to the government later on, they'll pay you for the work that you were doing.
That's right.
Okay,
And so
okay.
essentially, if you have that kind of a setup, you could absolutely take funds from other projects that you have, direct them into your IRAD program, and then use them to research whatever you want. And the beautiful thing about this, you see, is that when you do that, right, then people like Ronald Moultrie can come in and stand before Congress and say, oh, yeah, there are programs, but there are no contractual programs. There's nothing programmatic about it, right? I can't, and I think he even alludes to, I can't say for sure whether some contractor in some place, right? That's absolutely how they do it, right? And then it's all proprietary.
Yeah.
And are a lot of these programs just handshakes and yeah, wink, wink, you know what you're supposed to do. We'll see you in 6 months. Of course they are, right? Do
Yeah,
some of
yeah.
them have contract monitors, even though there's not a contract? Of course they do, right? Like they come in the contract, they want to do the monitoring for this program over here that happens to be in the same, in the same office building, happens to be with the same, managers, but don't worry about all that. Who's right? Like this is just normal. This is just corporate stuff, right? Like this is the thing. This is the stuff that they do, and IRAD's, just one thing. There's also something called an IDIQ, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, where you literally just say, hey, you seem like you're doing some good stuff. That sounds bad, doesn't it?
It sounds
IDIQ.
terrible. It's like, who knows? Maybe
Yeah.
soon, someday.
Yeah, like what like BAE, right, has had some really massive IDIQs, right? A lot of these services companies like SAIC, a lot of them have IDIQs where they're just like, hey, we're just going to throw a bunch of money at you and say that you're responsible for this concept or stuff. And then you're just going to, and these contracts are, enormous, hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And there's no right, like it's in the name, like we don't know when there's a due date, what the specific deliverables are, and so you could take money from that kind of a contract, funnel it into your IRAD, right? And there's just, as the vaguer it gets, the better, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a lot to be said there, that the contract vehicles do matter. That being said, if I'm Eric Davis or Hal Puthoff or anybody that works on one of these programs, I certainly do not want to be held responsible, right? I don't want the entire military industrial complex looking at me saying, oh, great job, bozo. You've got Congress looking at all of our contract vehicles now, and now they want us to change things, right? Like they
There
tried
goes the
to
gravy
get rid
train,
of they tried to get rid of IRAD in the in the late I think it's the late 60s. I think it's maybe 1970 or so. They tried to get rid of IRAD and they couldn't. But it's been tried before. And so that being said, talking about that publicly, is probably not a quick way to make friends. That being said, it's entirely possible that Davis really doesn't know anything about the contract vehicles and it just is what it is. But I'd be surprised if he's not pretty familiar with a lot of the things. If Grush is familiar with it, he's probably familiar with it.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of that would even be like sort of people in those industries would be aware of how these things are working because it's scuttlebutt, and you would follow.
Well, You know who would know a lot about IRAD would be the Invisible College, because in fact, I would call him maybe the most senior member of the Invisible College, who just died not too long ago, was Dr. Bob Wood, who just so happens to have been in charge of IRAD contracts for McDonnell Douglas, and was apparently very good at that work. And so, he knew a lot of things, right? And there are a lot of these figures, that are tied again back to this historical group, this movement. It just sort of, people look at them, they're like, oh yeah, it's the same cast of characters. It's like, yeah, it's the same cast of characters, and they're all somehow still involved with the intelligence community. The ones that are alive and kicking, they're still involved. You ever wonder why that is, right? Like,
yeah, they're deeply connected to all of these questions, and they're obviously around some very important things. Although it's hard to know what it's like, again, as with anything in the intelligence community, it's hard to know what they're saying, how much of it is actual meat and how much of it is gravy, or lettuce or whatever.
Yeah. Yep. And that's how that's how that works too. Like I talk a lot about intel laundering, where you take something that's very dubious and you weave it in with something that is true, so that whenever somebody associates, right, they talk about that, it's always associated with the thing that's been, or the person, right, that has been, so like the ARV thing, that's a very good, right? Like if we can tie that into somebody disreputable, like, I mean, I don't necessarily, to be honest, I really am agnostic on the Bob Lazar story, but to call him like that he's bulletproof, most people, I would say, like, would say that he's probably, that story doesn't have as much sand in the pants as maybe some other whistleblowers might have. So if you can tie things in with that, right, that's good. Like that's going
to create a lot of doubt right off the top.
That's right. The ARV story. You mean talk about Bob Lazar? I don't believe Bob Lazar. Like it's that's the way it kind of works. Oh, you're talking about the MJ12 documents? I don't believe the MJ12. Yeah. That's kind of the way these things are done. So
one of the things you kind of definitively said during your talk up there was that there are no ARVs or alien reproduction vehicles, and so I think that's really a kind of a bombshell, because there's so many theories out there, like, oh, this incident or that incident or another thing was an ARV, but I can sort of take your word for it. Because we barely scratched the surface of how they even. Yeah.
So I have some questions about this. So do you think anything's happened recently, maybe like in the last 10 years, that's real new, like advancements, like progress?
I'm not aware of it because I'm out of it now.
Sure.
I've been out of it
so that could be the case.
The HIP ended, so so I'm not read into it at the level I was for the OSAP and ATIP purposes. I don't know. All I do know is I was given a firm, hey, in 1989, the CIA shut it all down because us, and we know the other companies that we had been found out from our customer, didn't make any progress after several decades of investigating. There was no progress made. So I said, so what's the story about Northrop Grumman having an ARV or somebody out at Area 51 having an ARV? And he said, oh, that's all myth. They said the people that have been putting out there don't know what the hell they're talking about. And they don't know why, unless they're just another Bob Lazar type. They're just gonna, they're long on the truth and they're gonna tell a story.
Yeah. Is there any chance that was disinformation or that was passage material or anything like that?
No, it wasn't disinformation. It was, even Bob Lazar's information is disinformation. It's because they believe their own bullshit.
No, I'm sorry. I mean that they were telling you that there's no ARVs, we've made no progress.
Oh no, that's not disinformation.
Yeah,
no, that's coming straight on a classified level.
Sure.
With me having the need to know, and they don't have a need to give me this information.
Okay.
We're on a program, and we're going to give them contract money to work with us, and they're not going to sit there and bullshit with us if we're going to give them money.
I wouldn't think so. It's way too 5D chess, right? Yeah, I get it.
When you're saying ARV, do you mean like a one-to-one recreation of a UAP and NHI vehicle, or do you think there's aircraft systems that have kind of leveraged technologies off of
definitely no aircraft systems that have leveraged anything, and there's been no one-to-one reproduction. A lot of that fell into the psyche of the UFO community because of Bob Lazar and then Brad Sorensen and Mark McCandless. So I don't know where they're coming from, and then other people kind of came out of the woodwork saying the same thing, but No proof. I mean, there's been photographs, but those photographs, I haven't analyzed them. I don't remember if Bruce Maccabee looked at them. I know Bruce Maccabee had only said, he did. He did look at them, and he said that they definitely looked like hoaxes to him. But I don't think he ever issued a report on them, because he's got lots of reports on UAPs that he has done photo and film and video analysis of.
Have you ever spoken to the Brad Sorensen and McCandless?
No, Hal has. Hal Puthoff has.
So one of the things that keeps coming up, and it came up in the document that was released at the congressional hearing recently, the idea of alien reproduction vehicles, or even just reproduction vehicles, or technology of unknown origin. There's various acronyms for it. Again, the acronyms, but Eric Davis says they don't exist, as far as he knows, that development or progress stopped in '89, and that they never got further than the basics, if that. And so there was no opportunity to create these ARVs. But it has been kind of a part of the legend of the UFO topic forever. And in fact, they mentioned one particular legend that came up where there was, I guess, a shootout between various contractors who were sort of involved with an ARV incident of some sort. What are your thoughts on hearing all that? And do you think ARVs might actually be a thing, or is it the sort of the myth of the UFO, crowd?
Yeah, so I think, starting with the rumored shootout, I think this is something that Ross Coulthart has talked about a little bit. And, where this stems from is this issue where you do have, government groups like JSOC who are apparently, involved in crash retrieval programs. But then you do also have Lockheed Martin and other, defense contractors who are also involved in retrievals now and things like that. And so if these two things aren't coordinated, you can certainly get your wires crossed. And it may be that there is no coordination because there's a true competition, right? You spoke earlier about breakaway, civilizations. It may be that you do have a group that is doing things sort of like the government sanctioned way, right? And then there's these other groups who are trying to pounce on things before anybody else does. This is something that even, Gary Nolan has talked about recently, that there were, private groups who are trying to, that have the ability and they have the infrastructure. We talked earlier about, these like government services companies, right? Or like SAIC at a BDM. There are other contractors that do that as well, right? And so, it's not out of the question that a Lockheed Martin, right, would not have access to some of the same sensor systems and data, that the U.S. government has, that NORAD has, right? There are contracts that are drawn up for, hey, you're going to be the contractor that runs this system, that runs this. There are even, obviously there are groups that, I've seen recently a contract from SAIC where they're actually doing like human intelligence collection, right? They are actually contracted out to do this overseas. And, you can find like actual RFPs online. You can find, open source documents where they're trying to recruit people into this. And so, a lot of things that you would not expect the government to give a contract for, they give contracts for. They, I wouldn't call it outsourcing. You might call it insourcing, because a lot of these groups, they don't have to deal with the elected officials, right? They don't have to, it's proprietary, right? They don't have to deal with FOIA. And so, it's definitely, advantageous, especially if you've got all of your buddies that are, sitting on the board of directors, that are vice presidents, that are actually, going straight from government into these programs, then back to government, then back into these programs. I mean, that's sort of like the playbook for, the military industrial complex. And so, it may be safer with them than it is in government, where you do have people circulating through, and sometimes appointed by who knows who, right? Whoever we decide to put in the White House. And so I think that's, that being said, definitely there are some, cases where there are some interesting circumstances around some retrievals, which may hint at the fact that there were sort of some vying factions, if you will, who are looking to pounce on these. Not necessarily, obviously you always have the United States and its allies and then its adversaries, right? But at the same time, there might very well be competing, factions. And I think that the implication was that there were perhaps even people who were killed in some of these incidents, which is certainly problematic. And that needs to get squared away. Certainly somebody has to come and pick up the craft, right? And has to deal with these things if they crash or however they're brought down. But I do
with
think
some technical expertise and facilities, because these things are radioactive and they may have all kinds of issues that go along with them. I mean, all the people who are in treatment for the various injuries, apparently, from coming too close.
That's right.
So yeah,
that's right. Now, in terms of the ARV story, I think that I am partial to the idea that they exist, right? I don't know if they have let's say, all of the bells and whistles figured out. But I would be very surprised if, they've been looking at this since the 30s, 40s, right? That they haven't made any progress. That's a little suspect in my mind. I do also think, again, it's circling back to kind of at the beginning of our conversation. Dr. Davis can only say so much. Right.
Exactly right.
And he's not necessarily, just because he's, working at the OSAP does not mean that he has a need to know for every single aspect of the program. Like even the person who's briefing him may not know. Right. This is all very compartmented information, which he knows. Right. Like he's elucidating how it's all, this is all extremely, no one can talk to anyone. No one knows. Right. But then in this, he's like, "Oh no, this is the case. There are no ARVs, right? Like that.
Absolutely.
It's not disinformation. It would have to be disinformation, And like, I'm not. Again, I don't know that they have ARVs. That would be amazing if I did. I don't know that, but I would be extremely surprised to find out that there was, no progress whatsoever. That being said, you can also imagine in a situation where maybe, sure, there has been this breakaway civilization. They've made all of this progress. That being said, there still has to be some explainable increments in progress over time, right? We've got to stick to the schedule, right?
Yeah.
And so it's possible that this group that that we follow and obsess over, right, that they're trying to facilitate this schedule, right? They're trying to essentially unravel this narrative, this story that has to happen in order to eventually transfer this out, to the public or to wherever it is that they're trying to get this ultimately, this technology, these capabilities. And I think you have to have, even if you've got something that's working in your back pocket, that there are all kinds of reasons why you can't just drop that on, out of nowhere for national security, for, the economy, lots of different reasons. And so, I personally tend to believe the ARV story. I tend to believe Mark McCandlish.
Can you give us an outline of that real quick for people who may not know?
Yeah. So Mark McCandlish is he was actually an artist who would do drawings for like Popular Mechanics, and he would also anytime there was a new concept or an advanced concept, they would bring in people like Mark McCandlish to illustrate it, right? And so that's for magazines, but also for internally as they're looking at things, they would bring in people like McCandlish. So through this kind of network that he built up, he was very, very successful. He made a lot of contacts, and one of these contacts told him that he was taken to an air show, and he with a sort of like a VIP colleague who accidentally led him into a part of this air show that was for VIPs only, let's say. And there's this hangar, right? And in the hangar there are 3 different flying saucers, let's say, right, or roughly flying saucers, and that they were, in 3 different sizes, and they just that they look kind of old and beat up, like these are not, fresh off the assembly line, right? And that they make this presentation, that there are videos and things like that of these craft that are shooting off in different directions. And so Mark McCandlish learns about this. Apparently the VIP who had brought his friend to the show was like, just be quiet, don't say anything, I'll get you out of here. Right, like you're not supposed to, you could get into a lot of trouble, right, if you see this. And so what happens is this friend goes and talks to Mark McCandlish, and explains this whole this situation, what the craft looked like, and McCandlish produces this illustration, and it's kind of a semi like recognizable illustration now because it's been circulated, but that when he brought this back to his friend, he was essentially told, this is like so accurate that it's dangerous, right? Like I don't know how you got it but this is like exactly what I saw. And so there are, this story, he actually came out, he was a whistleblower that reached out to CSETI, right? Stephen Greer's group. He came out as one of Stephen Greer's disclosure project witnesses. And he never went back on his story. In fact, he found other people who corroborated the story from their perspectives inside of the MIC. And eventually he, blew himself away with a shotgun. And so, that tends to lend credence to the story, in my opinion.
Yes,
because,
absolutely.
that's a part of, a dark part of the story that, a lot of times doesn't get mentioned, and not to be morbid, but it's something where you look at that and it does make me take the story actually more seriously, not less seriously. If there are any unscrupulous security officers who are who happen to be listening, that makes us pay more attention, not less.
Yeah, exactly right.
And
It's like an exclamation point.
That's right. And they say, what was that guy onto? What was he looking at? Is it possible that was, that was completely, yeah, it's possible. But given what he was looking at, there were people who were telling him, this is dangerous. Like this is dangerous stuff. You have to imagine, if non-human intelligence and, their technology that we've recovered is highly classified, how much more classified would be the technologies that are ready to use that we've been able to? That would be like, you don't get just told that stuff. That is even people like Dr. Davis, people like Dr. Puthoff, they may get, if they get involved and they have a true need to know, then, they'll be brought in on that. But they keep these things separate for a reason. They don't want everybody having, the whole story. And so it would not surprise me at all if there are, ARVs or something akin to ARVs, at least with some of the, capabilities woven in. I would be very surprised if that were not the case.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a pretty alarming frequency of ARVs or UFOs seen in the vicinity of human technology, where they seem to be kind of moving together and cooperating in ways which makes you think that there is some sort of connection there that's beyond just trying to show up to the scene when a UFO is sighted. That sort of hints at that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What do you think about adversarial governments having, functional vehicles that they've strapped?
Okay, if they do, then basically, why are we still a country? Why haven't we been conquered? And especially if it's an adversarial government with the resources, because there are adversarial governments that don't have the resources. That'd be North Korea, Iran, right, and probably a few others, but the big ones would be China and Russia.
Yeah.
And
well, suppose it's still prototypical.
Yeah, right now they're still playing with conventional propulsion, like hypersonic missiles,
right,
supersonic missiles,
right,
subsonic missiles, multiple munitions, multiple warheads, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody's got an ARV type craft zipping over Ukraine, and Ukraine certainly hasn't been reporting any such things of that nature.
Right.
And they would have. They would have screamed bloody murder and taken it straight to the President of the United States, the CIA, the Department of State would have said, here's our photographs, and here's our recordings of it. And and look, there's a Russian symbol on it, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, no, that hasn't happened. I mean, if it was for real, we would see a dramatic change in the balance of power.
Yeah.
The United States, our intelligence agency would probably have known about it before Ukraine would have gotten hit in such a hypothetical story or scenario. And that just hasn't happened. So they haven't been successful. I can't believe they're any more successful than we.
But you do agree with Russia's contention that they have programs, they have wreckage, they have technology that they're poking at.
China is like a closed door. I know through how put up that they have at least one, and I think he might have gotten that officially through some work he did with the DIA, where he did go to China for them, but not for that reason.
Sure.
And he probably learned something over there.
Sure.
I think there's other sources that have said similar. Probably Dave Grush has more information on that than even I thought to ask him about. But Russia is one that had some crash retrievals. And that's been released when the Soviet Union fell. KGB opened up the files. George Knapp went there. Other people went there, found the Thread 3 documents. And I had independent, and I can't get into this because it's still super classified, but through the OSAP program, I had a connection in with a 3-letter agency that collected, not from the KGB open records, they collected it from their own asset, and the asset was filtering out actual legitimate documents, photos, reports, technical and operational and executive summary type, and we're going to have to go here really soon.
Sure. Yeah.
So there's enough evidence that I saw in classified setting that convinced me that they have it.
And have had for quite some time.
One
Russia.
crash retrieval, yeah.
Yeah.
But I can't say that it would go back to the 40s, 50s, or 60s, or 70s. I know
Yeah.
it was at the end of the 80s was the one I was exposed to.
Okay. All right.
So they have had something, and they've got hardware, but I don't see that they've been any successful.
More successful now.
Yeah.
One last question. Who's got it?
Go for it.
Go ahead.
You go. Okay, so are there any other breadcrumbs that you gave to Dave Grush that might be useful to us from kind of like an open source intelligence perspective that we could start to follow and kind of pick up and do our own research?
This is really super, it's classified still. The breadcrumbs I gave him are proprietary to NIDS and BASS, Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, and classified to the DIA and another 3-letter agency, and maybe 2. So I really can't share that. Maybe someday, I need to wait for a couple of people at the corporate level to die of old age. And when they do that, I won't have trouble with lawyers.
Right.
And then I'll come out with a book. Now, the classified stuff in that, I don't know what I'm going to do with that. That's classified for life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and they could declassify it up to 25 years, but I've had so much derivative classification training that I found out that the rules for declassification do include the ability to maintain classification up to even 75 years.
So BASS has to maintain that classification for 75 years. Wow.
Intense.
So if you sincerely can justify that you can't declassify after 25 years, then you'll have to implement one of the policies in the classification rules that you need to keep it classified. I think you could do it up to 50 and 75, but 75 seems to be the maximum.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Davis, thank you so much for sitting down with us. It's been incredibly revelatory, and we're so glad you came this year to give a talk at Sol. We hope we see you back again next year.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good to see you, John.
Yeah.
One of the final points that was in the conversation that I thought was really interesting was the discussion around who, Davis knew or didn't know had some sort of technology or that may have some technology. And he basically asserted that he believes Russia does have crash retrievals, but that China remains a mystery because it's so tightly controlled as a security state. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, that's obviously one of the big questions, right? Especially even around the ARV subject. Like, does China have crash retrievals? Have they managed to back engineer anything? Is that part of what we've been seeing? And if so, why aren't they just openly deployed? I mean, that's another question, especially with Russia. What did you think of what was said, and is there anything interesting that came out of that for you?
Yeah, no, I thought it was very interesting. One of the things that, he mentioned was, that China, that he actually had that he was aware that they had at least one, right, retrieve craft, and that he learned that from Dr. Hal Puthoff, right, his long-term colleague, especially, partner in his investigation partner, especially. They shared a lot of information and contacts and things like that. And one of the very interesting things he mentioned was that, he, Puthoff actually learned this information because he traveled to China. And that kind of rang a little bell in my head because I remembered, I think I've got that document, right? That there's a document, that sort of documents his report from when he traveled to China for the DIA in 1981, right? And so this is, of course, working with the at SRI for the remote viewing programs. Later they called it all Stargate. But it had several names, like Grow Flame is one of the longer standing ones. But he went to China. They were invited. He and several other scientists were invited by, I think it's the Chinese National Science Foundation, and to tour different facilities, to give lectures and hear lectures, and to sort of just meet their colleagues, right? And I think it is interesting to note that both Dr. Puthoff and several, many U.S. parapsychologists and physicists, right? They had pen pals in other countries, right? And they had pen pals in China. They had pen pals in Russia as well. In fact, Dr. Puthoff spoke a little bit of Russian. And so, you can find, at the Rice archives, you can actually find a lot of their correspondences back and forth with some of these individuals. So you'll find correspondences with Dr. Puthoff and some of these groups, Dr. Ed May, right, who took over as senior investigator at SRI and then carried it forward into the SAIC years as well. SAIC, by the way, received a sole source contract for the remote viewing program. SAIC also, in the late 80s, early 90s, actually opened a bureau in Russia, right? And brought over Russian researchers. There's collaborative, throughout even the 70s and 80s. You'd be surprised how much collaboration actually went on between Russia and China, but especially between Russia and the United States. And
It's so interesting because part of the impetus for the program to begin with was the idea that the Russians were ahead of the game.
Right.
I mean, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that that's a very deep dive, but very deep rabbit hole. But I do think that there is, just as here, a lot of the people that were involved in the remote viewing program and the study of psychoenergetics and things like that were also deeply interested in the UFO topic, because those two things are, as some people will not like me saying, but they're essentially inextricable. You can try and talk about one without the other, but they tend to go together. And so that's something that the way that it is in other countries, right, is similar to the way it is here. That Dr. Puthoff is, right, as a UFO guy, right, and not just a UFO guy who wants to, that's a belittling statement. He's someone who wants to actually work on the technology. And sure enough, he went and they worked with like the high energy physics scientists over in China. And so there's just a lot of potential places where they would meet people who either were interested in or involved in other studies. It's possible that certain places weren't quite as stovepiped as they are here, where it was maybe a little bit easier if you were involved in one to sort of jump into the other. And so I think that there's, people should definitely not we tend to think of the remote viewing program and UFOs as being completely separate, and they just weren't, right? I think that like there's not to say they're officially connected, but a lot of the people that were involved, right, or at least very interested in advocating for one, also were deeply interested, and that was in UFOs, and it's been that way since like the 60s, right? And actually even further beyond that, really, you could take that back to even the 1940s. There were, we have reports of people that were, programs that were looking at the connections between these two things. And so, official programs, not like, non-programmatic or, not moultrie fodder, but, actual real programs. So I thought that was a very interesting nugget, and it was very cool to be able to find, that document where, he actually went to China for the DIA in 1981. There's a final report. Anybody can Google it. In 1982, it's called Psychoenergetics Research in the People's Republic of China. I'll link you to it if you want to include that in the show notes. But yeah, very, very fun there. Looking at I can't remember what the Chinese call it extraordinary. Oh shoot, it's really funny. Like extraordinary human. Here we go. Extraordinary human body function. EHBF is what the Chinese called it. And it should also not go unnoted that there were several. This was not the only meeting, right? Like the Dr. Ed May. He also went to China. He also went to the USSR. Jacques Vallée. He went to Russia to meet the to meet UFO researchers, many of whom also happen to have been parapsychologists or connected to parapsychology. And, he also likewise had to, meet with the security officer. I can't remember if it was at SRI or SAIC, to kind of talk about, hey, here's what you don't do. Don't talk to these kinds of people. They put cameras in the hotel room, so be careful, like stuff like that. It's so, and of course they always debrief when they get back, and that's just known. And these kinds of connections, were very important to not the ending of the Cold War. I'm not sure that it ever truly ended, but at least in the phase that we popularly call the Cold War, these sort of scientific pen pal relationships were very crucial in bringing an end, right, to the Cold War. So
it's sort of recognizing the humanity and the curiosity on either side of the ocean, and building a little bit of cohesion. So I mean, we're through the whole video now. I mean, is there any final thoughts that you want to bring up about what you saw, or things that we didn't discuss that you think people should keep in mind? And also, are there things that you would have followed up and asked that weren't followed up and asked that maybe you'd like people just to have in their radar as questions that are still kind of lingering?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were, in terms of follow-ups, there would have been about 1 million follow-ups, most of which he probably could not or would not answer. But I do think, sort of along the same lines as you, I think I would have liked to have talked a little bit more about, what he's learned about the phenomenon and his experiences. He also co-authored a paper with Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée's a very wonderful paper, the 6-layer incommensurability model paper, right? He actually co-authored that with Vallée, and at the same time, we know he had experiences on the ranch. We know that we talked about in Loose Threads that he was actually part of the cohort of Kit Green's cohort looking at biological effects of craft on the body, on the human body. And so
and it's interesting, real quick on that, just to add in. I mean, Lou Elizondo often says that if you only knew what Eric Davis has done for the United States and for these topics, I mean, that it's so tantalizing, and it brings back all those connections. You're like, what is that, epic thing that bit of heroicism? I want to learn more about that. Damn it.
Yeah, and the other thing that he mentioned that wasn't dug into too much is he said that he was actually hired by the Central Intelligence Agency to be the I think like branch science, like the head scientist for WinPack, I think maybe, which would be a very, very high level prestigious position. I'm not sure that he's talked about that other places. I don't think it's on his LinkedIn. As someone who is a fan of LinkedIn of Dr. Eric Davis, someone's an avid fan of Dr. Eric Davis's LinkedIn page. I don't think that that's ever been on there, and so I don't. That was very interesting to me. I don't know if maybe that was supposed to happen and it didn't happen. But if that would certainly, you would think that that position might put him into an interesting spot to learn some new things. And it certainly would make sense why he would be one of the people sitting in on those high level OSAP briefings, if in these negotiations with Lockheed and the CIA, if he were working for the CIA at a certain point or had. So I would have definitely said, hey, can we talk more about that? When did you do that? And, like, how did that work out for you? Just some things like that. There are also, I do think I would have dug in a little bit more to the Aerospace Corporation. He did make some allusions to the fact that, well, I'd been involved in a little bit here or there. One of the things
he mentioned that the Aerospace Corporation was where was happening, I thought, right?
Yeah. That was one of the 4 places he was saying that was going to be, and that lined up with what Heisch was saying as well. And I think that, actually what's interesting is after Imminent came out, he was mad at Lou Elizondo, right? And he actually went off on went on to one of his Facebook comments tirades and kind of started to throw a little bit of shade in Elizondo's direction. And I kind of wondered at the time if that wasn't because Elizondo talked about the Aerospace Corporation and and that maybe Davis wasn't thrilled that was out there. I mean, that was one of the reasons why Davis initially had been reticent to talk about the Davis memo, the Wilson Davis notes, and a few other things, was that he was still working for the Aerospace Corporation, and he'd been told by his managers basically, don't talk about any of this stuff. And so that makes even more sense if he were actually, if he had a little bit of involvement here or there. He tried to. We know that Dr. Puthoff was trying to get involved possibly at the Aerospace Corporation. He sent his papers to in Jacques Vallée's Forbidden Science Volume 5. It says that he sent his papers to Pete Aldridge, who just so happens to have been the CEO or like the president of the Aerospace Corporation right before he had sent those papers. He became the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Technologies, which is a very high level position, probably very involved in the UFO subject. And he just left the Aerospace Corporation. And prior to that, he was at McDonnell Douglas, right? And so he may have been friendly, or at least had a friendly disposition to this group, a lot of whom had connections to McDonnell Douglas through the kind of like Bob Wood, Jack Houck kind of connections there. So I think that I would have been interested to see more questions about the Aerospace Corporation. That being said, he probably wouldn't have answered them because it's all proprietary, and he just can't. And I think he also mentioned that maybe he's furloughed and looking for maybe eager to jump back in, and so you certainly can't do anything to compromise those security clearances. As you're looking at those things. So. Other than that, I wanted to give a shout out to I always give a shout out to my co-author, Hermes, I always call him the second half of my brain. And so we always ping pong back and forth on these topics, especially like the PEDS question. I'm not the guy for that. If you had him on, oh man, he'd be able to tell you, go deep on that for you. But I think that, the other person I wanted to throw a shout out to was Chris Sharp, who has got a fan, in Eric Davis, who's apparently passing his articles off to people.
Yeah,
That's
and said
amazing.
It was a great piece at one point that he'd done, which is complimentary when you're dealing with all these complexities and characters and entities and organizations, to keep it all straight and to actually, keep people who are in the know satisfied with what your coverage is. That's impressive.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what he talked about there was really significant. In terms of kind of showing WinPack, just talking about WinPack and that like their role in managing sort of who gets what, right? And that they can also bring in whoever they want. I think that Davis maybe added a little bit of context to this because he also sort of said that, well, WinPack is multi-agency, right? And I think if I remember correctly, the interviewer asked basically, so is it basically there's no one really in charge? Like, is everybody just kind of doing their own thing? And it seemed to me Davis's response was to say, no, it's not like that. Like that WinPack is multi-agency and that, they can bring in anybody they want and and to work on whatever it is they want to work on. And so I think that's probably a hint, that a little breadcrumb there that, yeah, like this is a group that is able to do some things. And I do think that looking at collaborations between intelligence agencies is a good thing to do. There have been many of them. There are many of them. But that's what you need, and one of the things too to mention before we move on is, the intelligence community itself has been governed by someone who's at the Central Intelligence Agency, the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence. Back when Bill Casey took over, they basically became the head of the entire, coordinating the entire intelligence community. So if you have, this goal that we need to collect intelligence on this thing, right? There's actually, people at the Central Intelligence Agency, right? The head of the intelligence community staff, the ICS, that coordinate these things across all of these different agencies. And so, very powerful people, right? Beyond just the DCI, but like the people who have, become head over these different coordinating offices are very, very important. And I think they're important probably to this subject as well. So.
Absolutely. Well, that's pretty much all I had, Daniel. That was pretty exhaustive, I think. Thank you so much for all your research and your notes and your clarity and perspective. You've cracked it open for me in a lot of ways, obviously, since this typically isn't my area of specialty. So thank you. I'm forever grateful. I owe you one.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah.